Adeline Mercer slammed her grandmother's recipe box down on the counter of the last boarding house in Willow Creek, so hard that the lid cracked, and then she stood there, breathing hard, staring at the woman behind the desk who had just told her, without a single moment of hesitation, that there was no position available for someone of her particular build. Because the guests at this establishment expected a certain standard of appearance from the staff. Adeline didn't cry, she didn't beg. She picked up that broken box with both hands, looked the woman dead in the eye, and said, "Then God help your guests, ma'am, because whoever's feeding them doesn't know the first thing about making a person feel human." She walked out into the Montana summer and didn't look back once. If this story already has you feeling something, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow Adeline's story all the way to the end. Because I promise you, it is going to be worth every single minute. And drop a comment below telling me what city or state you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The summer of 1884 arrived in Willow Creek, Montana, like it always did, hot, dry, and unforgiving. The kind of summer that made tempers short and judgments fast. The kind of summer where a stranger stepping off the afternoon stagecoach got looked up and down before they even had a chance to speak. Adeline Mercer had been looked up and down so many times in her 29 years that she had stopped flinching when it happened. She felt the eyes on her the moment her boots hit the dirt. She was a plus-size woman with dark hair pinned back under a travel-worn hat, wearing a dress that had seen better days and carrying nothing but an old wooden recipe box tucked under one arm, a box with a cracked lid, because she'd slammed it on a counter about 4 hours ago and hadn't had the time or the emotional reserves to feel sorry about it since. She straightened her spine, adjusted the box under her arm, and walked forward. Willow Creek was the kind of town that looked friendly from a distance. It had a general store with a painted sign, a church with a clean white steeple, a saloon that was already humming with noise, even in the middle of the afternoon. There were women in nice dresses walking with parasols, and men in good hats tipping them to each other outside the bank. It looked like exactly the kind of town where a person could start over. Adeline had been fooled by towns like this before. She had been traveling for 11 days. Before that, she had worked for 3 years at the Hargrove Hotel in Cheyenne. Long days, brutal hours, cooking for anywhere from 30 to 70 guests at a stretch, doing it with precision and care and a kind of quiet pride that she had held onto through everything. She had been good at that job. She had been better than good. The guests had asked for her by name. The dining room had filled up in a way it hadn't before she arrived. And then Mrs. Hargrove had called her into the office on a Tuesday morning, folded her hands on the desk, and explained in a tone so polite it was almost worse than cruelty that the hotel was making certain changes, that the establishment had a particular image to maintain, that the guests, she was sure Adeline would understand, expected a certain presentation from the staff who served them, and that a woman of Adeline's, she had paused here, searching for a word that wasn't the word she actually meant, stature, might be better suited to a different type of establishment. What? Adeline had walked out of that office with a week's wages and a reference letter so vague it was nearly useless. She had tried 2 other towns after Cheyenne, got work in one of them for about a month before the owner's wife decided she didn't like the way the men at the lunch counter seemed too comfortable around the cook. Lost the other opportunity before she even started, when the woman doing the hiring looked her over in the doorway and said, without any apparent embarrassment, that she was looking for someone with a bit more of a delicate constitution. So now she was in Willow Creek, Montana, last up on the line, more or less. She had enough money left for maybe 4 nights at a boarding house if the rates were reasonable, and she intended to use every one of those 4 days to find something that would let her stay. She started with the boarding house nearest the stage stop. The woman at the desk, a Mrs. Pullman, according to the sign above the door, was maybe 50. Sharp-eyed, with the kind of expression that had probably been pleasant once and had been worn down into something harder over years, of running a business in a town full of opinions. She looked at Adeline the way people looked at something they were trying to calculate the trouble of. "I'm looking for kitchen work," Adeline said, keeping her voice level. "I have 3 years of hotel experience and I can provide references. I'm a strong cook, I work clean, and I don't require much beyond meals and a room, Mrs." Pullman looked her up and down, slowly, making no effort to disguise what she was doing. "We run a respectable establishment here," she said finally. Adeline waited. "Our guests have certain expectations, Mrs." Pullman continued. "About the standard of the food?" Adeline asked. A brief, uncomfortable pause. Of the general presentation. Adeline set her recipe box on the counter. "Ma'am," she said, "I have been making biscuits since I was 7 years old. I can butcher a chicken faster than most men, and I can stretch a pound of dried beans into a meal that'll make grown men cry. I'm not asking you to put me in the front room. I'm asking to cook in your kitchen, Mrs." Pullman's expression didn't shift. "I don't think it's going to be a good fit," she said. Adeline picked up her box. "Thank you for your time," she said. And meant none of it. She tried the restaurant on the main street next. The owner, a round-faced man named Gerald Potts who wore his apron like a badge of authority, listened to her for approximately 45 seconds before he said he was fully staffed. There were no other employees visible anywhere in the building. She tried the saloon, specifically the cook's position that someone had told her on the stage might be open. The barkeep, a wiry man with a kind face, actually seemed interested until his business partner came out of the back room, took one long look at Adeline, and said, "We need someone who can handle this crowd. Hector, someone the boys won't distract." He said it like she wasn't standing right there. Like she was a piece of furniture being evaluated for a room she didn't suit. She tried 2 more places before noon, got the same answer in different words each time. She ate her lunch sitting on a bench outside the general store, a piece of bread and some dried fruit she'd been rationing since the stage, and she did not cry. She had made herself a promise somewhere around the second town she'd tried after Cheyenne. She was not going to cry in public anymore. She was going to feel whatever she felt, and then she was going to figure out what came next. What came next, apparently, was an old man sitting at the other end of the bench, eating a tin of something and watching her with the unhurried curiosity of someone who had nowhere particular to be. "You looking for work?" he asked. Adeline looked at him sideways. "What gave it away?" "The box," he said, nodding at the recipe chest in her lap. "Cook's tools. And the look on your face like you've had a door shut on you about 6 times this morning." "5, she said. "Not that I'm counting." The old man made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Name's Pete Hadley. I work out at the Brooks Ranch, about 4 miles east." "Good for you," Adeline said, not unkindly. "They're looking for a cook," Pete said. "Have been for 3 months. Lost 2 of them, one quit after a week, and the other one had some kind of disagreement with the supply situation. Mr. Brooks's fare pays on time, doesn't bother the help with nonsense." He paused. "He's also about as warm as a fence post in January. But that ain't something a paycheck can't make up for." Adeline looked at him properly for the first time. He had the face of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "Why are you telling me this?" Pete shrugged. "Because I've been coming into this town for 20 years, and I know how it treats people who don't fit what it thinks a person ought to look like. And I'm tired of it." He stood up, creaking a little at the knees. "Ranch is 4 miles east. Take the fork at the Cottonwood. Can't miss it." He looked at her once more, not unkindly. "Mr. Brooks judges by the work, not by much else." He walked away before she could thank him. She sat on that bench for another 10 minutes, working it over in her head. 4 miles was walkable. She had walked farther on worse days. The boarding house money would run out whether she spent sitting here or spent it on a room while she tried the ranch. And the alternative was getting back on a stage to somewhere else. And she was genuinely not sure she had another somewhere else left in her. She picked up her recipe box, stood up, brushed off her skirt, and walked east. Brooks Ranch announced itself before she could see it properly. She heard it first. The sound of cattle moving somewhere beyond a tree line. The distant bark of a dog, the ring of something metal being worked. Then the smell, grass and horses and wood smoke. Then the buildings themselves came into view. And she stopped for just a moment to take them in. It was a working ranch, not a grand one, not the kind you saw in illustrations in Eastern magazines with white fences and decorative flourishes. This was a place that had been built with function in mind and maintained with care. The barn was solid. The bunkhouse looked well kept. The main house was large enough to be substantial without being showy. Everything about it said, this is a place where serious work gets done. There were men moving around. She counted at least 8 from where she stood, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing when they saw her coming up the track. She kept walking. A man near the corral fence leaned over to say something to the man next to him. She couldn't hear it, but she saw the other man look at her and grin. Another one, up near the barn door, crossed his arms and waited with the particular patient amusement of someone expecting entertainment. She kept walking. She went to the main house, knocked on the door. Waited. The man who answered was not what she expected, though she would have struggled to say exactly what she had expected. He was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that she had to look up slightly when the door swung open. Probably 38 or so, dark hair going a little gray at the temples. A face that had spent a great deal of time in the sun and wind and had been shaped by it. Not softened. He was wearing working clothes, not dressed up, not dressed down, and he had the look of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something and wasn't particularly delighted about it, but who had enough manners to answer his own door. He looked at her. His expression didn't change much. He wasn't rude about it, but he was thorough. He took in the travel-worn dress, the cracked recipe box, the 4 miles of Montana summer that she was probably wearing on her face right now. "Can I help you?" he said. "I heard you need a cook," Adeline said. "My name is Adeline Mercer. I have 3 years of hotel kitchen experience in Cheyenne, and I can provide a reference from the head chef at the Hargrove, who is honest enough that his letter will tell you both what I'm good at and what I'm not." She paused. "I'm good at nearly everything." He studied her for a moment. "Word travels fast," he said. "Old man named Pete Hadley told me about the position." Something shifted very slightly in his expression at the mention of Pete, not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Pete's been with this ranch 12 years, he said. He doesn't recommend people for sport." "No, sir," Adeline said. "I don't think he does." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back slightly from the door, not inviting her in. Exactly, but opening the space enough that the conversation could continue without her standing on the porch like a salesman. "What happened to your box?" he asked, nodding at the cracked lid. "I set it down too hard on a counter in town," Adeline said. "After someone told me my particular build wasn't suited to their kitchen." Not a flicker. "Their loss," he said, matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. Adeline blinked. She hadn't expected that. "Nathaniel Brooks," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go immediately, which she appreciated. "How many men are you feeding?" she asked. 12, during peak season. 7 to 9 the rest of the time. "We're in peak season." He glanced past her toward the yard. "They're not easy to feed. Long days, hard work, no patience for food that doesn't do its job." "What does a meal need to do?" Adeline asked. He looked at her again in that same careful, measuring way. "It needs to remind 12 exhausted men that someone thought they were worth cooking for," he said. "That's all." Adeline looked at him for a moment. Then we want the same thing, she said. Mr. Brooks, can you feed 12 hungry men after 14 hours of hard labor, she said, echoing back something close to what she'd imagined this conversation might be. Because that's what I need to know you need. And I need you to judge my cooking and not my size. I don't judge by size, Nathaniel said. I judge by whether the work gets done. He held her gaze. 1 week. I'll pay you for the week regardless of outcome. If the men eat and the kitchen runs clean, we discuss terms. That's fair, Adeline said. Good. He stepped back fully. Kitchen's in the back. I'll have Pete show you where things are. He paused. The men will give you trouble, he said, not an apology. Just a statement of fact. I'll expect you to handle it. I've been handling it all my life, Adeline said. For the first time, something that might have been the ancestor of a smile crossed Nathaniel Brooks's face. It lasted about half a second, and then it was gone. Come in then, he said. Pete Hadley met her in the back hallway with the expression of a man who had been expecting her. Told you, he said. You told me he was like a fence post in January, Adeline said. That's later in the year, Pete said. Right now it's August. Give it time. He pushed open the kitchen door, and she walked in. And that was when she understood the full scope of what she had agreed to. The kitchen was not terrible. It was not. But it was the kitchen of a place that had gone 3 months without someone who truly knew what they were doing in it. The shelves were disorganized in a way that suggested multiple people had looked for things and put them back in whatever spot was convenient rather than the spot they belonged. There were supplies she could see had been 2 half-empty sacks of flour where 1 full one should have been, and things that were missing that she already knew she'd need. The large iron stove was serviceable but hadn't been properly cleaned since whenever the last cook left. There was a window over the work counter that faced east, which meant good morning light, which was the first genuinely encouraging thing she'd found since she walked off the stage. She set her recipe box on the counter and opened it carefully. Even though the lid was cracked, her grandmother's handwritten cards were all still there, organized in the system her grandmother had devised by season. Then by what you had, not by what the recipe assumed you could get. Frontier cooking, the real kind. What we got in the larder, she asked Pete. He showed her it was not nothing. Flour, dried beans, potatoes starting to go soft but salvageable, some decent dried herbs, a side of beef that was a tougher cut than ideal, 2 bushels of apples, cornmeal, some salt pork lard, and a small jar of cinnamon and nutmeg that looked like it had been there for a year. That's all, she asked. Till the supply run Friday, Pete said. Today was Tuesday. Adeline looked at what she had. She thought about what she could do with it. She thought about her grandmother's voice, telling her that the best cooking in the world was never about having enough, it was about knowing what enough could become. All right, she said. I need the stove hot in an hour. And I need those potatoes in here so I can sort through them. Pete raised an eyebrow. You cooking tonight? I'm cooking tonight, she said. I'm not waiting until morning to find out whether this works. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am, he said, and meant it. She cooked for 4 hours straight. The beef was tough, so she did what her grandmother had taught her. Low heat, patience, and every scrap of flavor she could coax from the bones and scraps. She made a stew that would run long and deep, and while it worked on the stove, she baked a pan of biscuits precise measurements. The right amount of fat, just enough time in the heat, and then she took those apples and turned them into smelt like October and comfort, and a life that was maybe better than the one you were currently living. She didn't stop to rest. She sorted through the potatoes while things cooked. She reorganized the bottom 2 shelves. She found a crack in the window caulking that was letting in cold air and stuffed it with a rag until it could be properly fixed. She built a mental inventory of everything she had and everything she'd need to ask for on Friday. She was aware in the back of her mind of voices outside. Men passing the kitchen window. The occasional pause that meant someone was looking in. Once she heard a low voice say something she couldn't make out, followed by a stifled laugh. She kept cooking. She plated the food at 7:30 and sent Pete to tell the men it was ready. She waited in the kitchen. She heard them coming before she saw them, boots on the floor. The low rumble of conversation, the scrape of chairs at the long table in the dining room. And then the silence. The particular, sudden silence that meant something had stopped them. She didn't go out there. She stayed in the kitchen and kept her hands busy. It was Nathaniel who came in first. He appeared in the kitchen doorway like he'd materialized out of the air. Quiet the way she was beginning to understand he was always quiet. He looked at the stove, the counter, the reorganized shelves. Then he looked at her. "Where did you find the cinnamon?" he said. "Back of the top shelf," she said, "behind the spare lantern oil." It hadn't expired. He was quiet for a moment. "The men haven't been this quiet at a meal in 6 months," he said. "That's either very good or very bad. I'll let you decide," she said. He nodded once, turned to leave, and then stopped. Turned back halfway. "Yes? What did you put in it?" "Thyme," she said. "Mostly." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Then he turned and went back to the dining room, and she heard his boots on the floor, and then the sound of a chair scraping, and then nothing but the low sounds of 12 men eating in something very close to reverence. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 4 hours. By morning, things were different. She noticed it in small ways. The men who had watched her walk up the track the day before with those particular expressions, she knew those expressions. She had been cataloging them her whole life. They came into the kitchen for coffee, before breakfast, without the expressions. Not warmly, most of them. Not with any great rush of acceptance. But without the expressions. There was a big man named Cody, broad-shouldered, who she would learn was Nathaniel's most experienced hand, 15 years on the ranch. 20 in cattle work before that, the kind of man who made up his mind about things quickly, and then didn't revisit the decision. He came in, poured his coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen window like he was looking at the day, and then set the cup down and said, without looking at her, "Biscuits were good." "Thank you," she said. He left. That was the whole conversation, but she understood what it meant. There was a younger man, maybe 19, who came in last and hung back near the doorway, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. He had red hair and a face full of freckles, and the general demeanor of someone who had been the youngest person in any given room for his entire life. "You need something?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he said. He stopped. "Is there more of the apple thing?" "Not this morning," she said. "But I'll make it again." His face did something complicated. "My ma used to make something like that," he said. "With cinnamon." "Mine too," she said. "Well, my grandmother." He nodded. "Still an Eli," he said. "Eli Marsh." "Adeline Mercer," she said. "You can come in, Eli. This is a kitchen, not a church. You don't have to stand at the door." He grinned a quick, real grin that changed his whole face and came in and sat at the small table near the window. And she gave him the last biscuit from the pan, while she started on breakfast for the rest of them. And that was how she made her first real friend at Brooks Ranch. The week moved fast in the way that weeks do when every hour is full. She cooked 3 meals a day. She managed the kitchen supplies with the careful attention of someone who had done more with less many times before. She started a list for the Friday supply run and went over it with Nathaniel. On Thursday evening, he sat across the kitchen table from her with a lamp between them and went through the list item by item with the methodical attention of a man who ran his business seriously. "Why twice the dried herbs?" he asked. "Because I'm using them regularly now," she said. "Which I'm guessing the previous arrangement wasn't." "Previous cook used mostly salt," Nathaniel said. Without any particular expression. "Salt is important," she said. "But it's not cooking." He looked at the list again. "Non-negotiable," she said. A pause. "All right," he said and made the note. The men continued warming up in increments. It was not a dramatic transformation. These were working cowboys. Not men given to displays of sentiment, but it was real. They started saying good morning when they came in for coffee. Cody started asking what was for dinner in the afternoons. Not complaining, just asking the way a person asks when they're looking forward to the answer. Eli started helping her carry things without being asked. And Nathaniel came into the kitchen in the evenings. Sometimes when the day's work was done, not to talk. Particularly, he would get a cup of coffee and stand at the window or sit at the table with some piece of ranch business he was reading. And Adeline would be doing whatever remained of the kitchen work. And they would occupy the same space in a companionable quiet that she found, to her mild surprise, more restful than most conversation. He was not unfriendly. He was simply self-contained in a way that suggested a person who had spent a long time in the company of their own thoughts. She learned, gradually, the small things, that he drank his coffee plain and didn't much like sweet things. That he had a habit of reading things twice before he made a decision on them. That when something bothered him, he went quiet in a particular way that was different from his regular quiet. And that she had started to be able to tell the difference. She didn't ask about the previous Mrs. Brooks. Pete had told her, simply and without embellishment, that there had been one. And that she had died 4 years ago, and that Nathaniel had been running this ranch alone ever since, in every sense that mattered. That was enough for her to understand the specific texture of the silence in this house and why the kitchen had stopped feeling like the heart of anything for a while. She was thinking about that on Thursday evening, the evening before the end of her trial week. When she was cleaning up after supper and heard voices as outside, not from the bunkhouse, but from closer, the sound of men from town. She looked out the window and saw 2 riders she didn't recognize pulling up at the edge of the yard, talking to Cody, and Cody's whole body going stiff in the way that bodies go stiff when a conversation turns unwelcome. She couldn't hear the words through the glass. She saw Cody shake his head. Saw one of the riders lean in with something. Saw Cody cross his arms and hold his ground. She didn't go outside. It wasn't her place, not yet. Not after only a week. But what until the riders turned around and left. And she watched Cody stand there, looking after them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not anger. Exactly. Something more complicated than anger. When Nathaniel came in for his evening coffee, he brought it with him, the particular quality of quiet that meant something was wrong. She didn't ask. She finished drying the last of the dishes and hung the cloth on its hook and poured herself a cup from the pot. She sat down at the kitchen table, not across from him. Not directly, just at the same table, and let the silence sit for a moment. "The Hargrove letter," he said, without looking up from the paper in his hands. "What about it?" "It's a good letter," he said. "He makes it clear you're a capable cook. He doesn't say much about why you left. He's a fair man," Adeline said. Fair enough not to put his wife's reasons in writing. Nathaniel looked up from the paper at that. His wife's reasons, he repeated. "The hotel had a certain image to maintain," she said. "I didn't fit the image." He held her gaze for a long moment. "The men who just rode out," he said. "They were from the Aldridge family. They have the largest operation on the other side of the county line and considerable influence in town." She waited. "They came to express concern," he said, and the flatness in his voice said everything the words didn't. "About my standards, about what my choice of staff implies about my judgment. About whether I've thought carefully about the impression I'm making on the business community." The kitchen was very quiet. Adeline said. Nathaniel set the paper down on the table. He looked at her in the direct, undecorated way that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things when he had made up his mind about them. "And I told Cody to let them know I run my ranch on my own judgment," he said. "And that I'm not in the habit of making business decisions based on other people's opinions of my kitchen staff." Adeline looked at him for a moment. Something tight in her chest, something she had been carrying for a very long time. Something she had not even fully named to herself shifted. Slightly. Just slightly. Mr. Brooks, she said. I want you to understand something, all right, he said. I am a good cook, possibly an excellent one, but wherever I go. This she gestured at herself, not self-consciously. Just factually follows me. And the conversation you just described with those riders is a conversation that will happen again. In this town and probably others. And I need you to know that before you make any decisions. Because if you're going to change your mind about me in 2 months when the pressure gets louder, I would rather know now. Nathaniel picked up his coffee, drank it, set the cup down. He was quiet for long enough that she had time to wonder whether she had overstepped. Miss Mercer, he said finally, I have been running this ranch for 15 years. I have had business partners try to tell me how to raise my cattle. Neighbors try to tell me how to manage my land, and a significant portion of Willow Creek try to tell me how to grieve my wife on their preferred timeline. He paused. I have not yet found that taking other people's opinions of my own business improved either the business or my life. He looked at her. You can stay as long as the work is good. That's the only condition I put on employment here. Adeline sat with that for a moment. Then I'd like to stay, she said. Good, he said. Supply run is tomorrow. Your list is approved. He took his coffee cup to the counter, rinsed it himself, which she noticed, and headed for the door. He paused at the threshold the way she had started to notice he did when something else needed saying. The apple dessert, he said. The men have been asking if you're making it again. I was planning on Sunday, she said. Make it Saturday, he said. They'll work harder if they have something to look forward to. And then he was gone. His boots quiet in the hall, the back door closing softly behind him. Adeline sat at the kitchen table by herself in the lamplight for a while. She thought about the boarding house in Willow Creek that had told her she wasn't the right presentation. She thought about 3 years in Cheyenne. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, which had been the safest place she had ever known, and the recipe box with its cracked lid sitting on the counter behind her. She thought about the way Nathaniel Brooks had said their loss flat, factual, no performance in it, and then just moved on to the next thing. She thought about the particular quality of the silence in this kitchen when it was just her in it, working, and how it was the first silence in years that had felt like hers. Then she stood up, banked the stove for the night, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. She had a supply list to execute in the morning. And Saturday she was making the apple dessert. The week after her trial ended was the week the town of Willow Creek decided to make itself known. It started small, the way these things always started small. A comment at the general store she heard it only half. Something about that Brooks woman, which was inaccurate and insulting in roughly equal measure. A cool reception at the dry goods counter from a woman who had been perfectly pleasant to Pete when he was doing the supply runs alone. A long look from Mrs. Pullman, the boarding house woman. When Adeline passed her on the main street, a look that managed to say, I knew this wouldn't work out, before anything had actually not worked out. She didn't let any of it slow her stride. What slowed her, briefly, was the afternoon she came back from a supply run to find 3 women from the town's social circle standing in the ranch yard, having what appeared to be an important conversation with Nathaniel. She could see from 20 yards away that it was not a comfortable conversation. The women had that particular posture of people delivering a message they had rehearsed and were determined to finish delivering, regardless of the reception. She went around to the kitchen entrance and unloaded the supplies and started on dinner. She heard boots on the porch about 40 minutes later, and Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. Ladies from the Women's Social Committee, he said. I know who they are, she said, without looking up from the pot. They feel that my employment choices reflect poorly on the moral standards of the ranch. He said it the same way he might have said, the fence in the east field needs repair. They expressed this concern for approximately 15 minutes. And she said. And I thanked them for their time, he said. She looked up at him now. That's it? I also told them that if they had concerns about the food being produced on this property, they were welcome to come in and have a meal before they formed their opinions. He picked up his cup from the shelf and poured coffee. None of them accepted. Their loss, Adeline said, using his words back at him, and she was almost certain. She caught something that was the real ancestor of a smile this time. More than half a second before it disappeared into the cup. Their loss, he agreed. But she lay awake that night thinking about the Women's Social Committee and the writers from the Aldridge family and Mrs. Pullman's look on the main street. She had been in enough towns to know when the pressure was only beginning. She had been in enough situations to know that Nathaniel Brooks's calm certainty was a real thing, not performance. Not stubbornness for its own sake, but something that came from a man who had been through worse and knew his own mind. But she also knew that calm certainty didn't stop a town from making a person's life difficult in the 100 small ways a town could, if it decided to. She thought about whether it would have been smarter to move on. Whether she was making his life harder by staying. Whether the right thing to do was the thing she always ended up doing, which was making herself smaller, making herself easier, making herself less of a problem. And then she thought about the men at the dining table. About Eli's face when he said, "My ma used to make something like that." About Cody saying biscuits were good at the kitchen window. About the particular sound of 12 exhausted men eating a meal that someone made for them with care. She was not making herself smaller. She had made that decision before she walked in the front door. And she was going to stand by it. She thought about Nathaniel's voice. Flat and certain, their loss. She thought about the supply list on the table and the Saturday apple dessert and the cracked recipe box on the kitchen counter that had survived 11 days on the stage and 4 miles of Montana summer and every single closed door in between. She turned over in her bed. She thought, I am still here. She thought, that will have to be enough for tonight. And then she closed her eyes and she slept, and in the morning she got up and lit the stove and began. The morning after her decision to stay, Adeline woke before the sun. That was not unusual for her. She had been waking before the sun since she was old enough to help her grandmother in the kitchen, since the days when the dark before dawn was the only quiet a household full of people ever got. And her grandmother had taught her that if you wanted to think clearly, that was the hour to do it. The hour before everyone else needed something from you. She lay still for a moment and took stock. She was in a small room off the back of the main house, not the bunkhouse, which was for the ranch hands, but a room that had apparently been a storage space at some point, and had been converted, not luxuriously, into something habitable. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a peg on the wall, and a window that faced the barn. It was plain and it was hers, and she was grateful for it, in the way you become grateful for small things when large things have been denied you long enough. She got up. She dressed. She went to the kitchen. By the time the first ranch hand wandered in for coffee, she had the stove running hot, a pot of oats going steady, and a pan of salt pork starting to crisp at the edges the way it needed to. Eli was first through the door. As he usually was, she had learned by now that Eli Marsh was a boy who had trouble sleeping and made up for it by being everywhere early. He poured his coffee and sat at the small table and said nothing, which was also usual, and she let him be. Some people talked in the mornings, and some people needed the quiet to get their bearings. And she had spent enough time in working kitchens to know the difference. Cody came in next. Then 2 men she was still learning the names of. There was a quiet one called Hatcher who always nodded at her when he came in, and a louder one called Roy who always looked at the pot before he looked at anything else, which she had decided was a compliment. "What is that smell?" Roy said. Not as a question. "Salt pork," she said. "And if you touch that pan before it's done, I will personally move your breakfast to Thursday." Roy stepped back from the stove with his hands up in a gesture of surrender. And Hatcher made a sound that might have been a laugh. And Eli grinned into his coffee cup, and the kitchen moved forward into the morning, the way it had begun to move like something that had its footing now. That was the rhythm she had built in 9 days. Not a dramatic thing. Not the kind of change that announced itself. Just a slow, consistent accumulation of mornings and dinners and late evenings when the stove got banked and the kitchen went quiet. And the men at Brooks Ranch began to expect food that was ready when it should be ready. Flavors that meant something. A space where you could come in and put your cup down and breathe for a minute before the day's work started back up. She had not expected to feel at home so quickly. She had been careful. In fact, not to let herself feel too at home, because she had learned from experience that the feeling of belonging was often revoked with very little warning. And the distance between feeling at home and feeling its absence was a drop that got steeper every time you fell into it. But she was here. The work was good, and Nathaniel Brooks had told the Women's Social Committee to form their opinions over a meal they hadn't taken him up on. That for now was enough. What she hadn't counted on was Eleanor Aldridge. She heard the name before she met the woman. She heard it from Roy, who was not by nature a gossip, but occasionally became one when he was bored enough, and who mentioned while eating his second helping of the bean stew she'd made from the Friday supplies that the Aldridge family had a daughter-in-law who had apparently been telling people at church that Nathaniel Brooks had lost his mind. On account of the cook, Roy added, with a look in Adeline's direction that managed to be apologetic and matter-of-fact at the same time. On account of me, Adeline said. Yes, ma'am. And what exactly has Mrs. Aldridge been saying? Roy shifted in his seat. That Mr. Brooks is letting his grief affect his judgment. That a man in his position has a responsibility to the community. That a ranch with his reputation shouldn't be. He stopped. Shouldn't be what? She said. Shouldn't be setting that kind of example, Roy said. Looking uncomfortable. Her words, Miss Mercer. She let it sit for a moment. She finished what she was doing at the counter. She was crimping the edge of a pastry she'd figured out how to make with the lard and the good flour. The first proper pie she'd attempted at the ranch, and she let it sit. And she thought about Eleanor Aldridge, whom she had never met, discussing what kind of example her presence at Brooks Ranch was setting for the community. Roy, she said. Ma'am, you've worked here how long? 6 years come September, he said. And in those 6 years, has anyone from the Aldridge family ever put food on your table? A pause. No, ma'am. Then I wouldn't lose much sleep over their opinions, she said, and slid the pie into the oven. Roy finished his stew. He was quiet for a minute, and then, he said, without looking up, The stew's real good, Miss Mercer. I know, she said. Thank you, Roy. He grinned at that, and the kitchen moved on. Eleanor Aldridge arrived at Brooks Ranch on a Wednesday morning. 10 days into Adeline's time there, with 2 other women from the county's social circle, and the particular posture of someone who has arranged their expression in advance. Adeline heard the horses from the kitchen. She heard Cody's voice in the yard, formal, not warm, and then boots on the porch steps, and Nathaniel's voice, even and measured, welcoming them inside. She stayed in the kitchen. She had the lunch preparation to manage and approximately no desire to present herself for inspection, which was clearly what this visit was designed to produce. For about 20 minutes, she could hear the murmur of conversation from the front room, not the words, just the cadence which told her enough. Nathaniel's voice, steady and unhurried. The other voices, higher, more animated. The cadence of people who had come to make a point and were working their way around to it. Then she heard her name, clearly, through the wall. Mrs. Aldridge, Nathaniel said, and his voice had changed, not louder, not angrier, just flatter, the way it went when something had reached its limit. I'm going to stop you there. A pause. My kitchen is not a subject that requires the input of anyone who doesn't work in it or eat from it. I have a cook who is doing excellent work, and the men on this ranch are well fed and in better spirits than they have been in 2 years. I do not know what other evidence of competence you require. But I am not in the practice of firing capable staff because of social discomfort. Nathaniel. A woman's voice controlled. Practiced. We're not asking you to fire anyone. We're asking you to think about what people will say. I've thought about it, he said. It took about 10 seconds and I arrived at the same conclusion I usually arrive at when other people's opinions are the primary argument, which is that I run this ranch and not the town's opinion of it. Another pause. Longer. You're being deliberately difficult. I'm being honest, he said. Which is something I prefer over the alternative. I appreciate you making the trip, Mrs. Aldridge. The door is behind you. Adeline stood very still in the kitchen. She heard movement from the front room, then boots on the porch, then horses in the yard, then quiet, then Nathaniel's boots in the hall, and the kitchen door opening. He did not look like a man who had just had an argument. He looked exactly the same as he always looked, contained. Steady, slightly tired around the eyes the way he always was by mid-morning. He poured coffee, stood at the counter. I heard some of that, Adeline said. I know, he said. The walls in this house are not as thick as I'd prefer. She turned from the pot she'd been stirring and looked at him properly. You didn't have to do that, she said. I want you to know I understand if you don't, he said. Not unkindly, just firm. I made my position clear. It doesn't require ongoing discussion. Nathaniel. She used his first name for the first time without thinking about it. And she saw him register it, a brief flicker. I have been asked to make myself smaller by people with more power than Eleanor Aldridge for my entire adult life. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, but I need you to tell me honestly. Is this going to cause you real damage? The kind of damage that affects the ranch's business? He was quiet for a moment. Not the flat quiet that meant he was done with a conversation, but the other kind, the kind that meant he was actually considering the question. The Aldridge family has accounts with 2 banks in town, he said. They have influence with the county commissioner. They are not people whose social displeasure is entirely without consequence. Then I should think about. I'm not finished, he said. He set down the cup. I have a contract with the Northern Pacific Railroad for beef supply that has nothing to do with the Aldridge family. I have 15 years of reputation in this county as a fair dealer and a reliable rancher. And I have 12 men who came into breakfast this morning in better shape than they've been in since I can remember. He paused. The Aldridges can be displeased. They'll survive it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a stubborn man, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. And the ghost of that almost smile came and went in about a quarter of a second. I've been told. He picked up his coffee and went back to his work. And Adeline turned back to the pot, and neither of them said anything else. And the kitchen continued to smell like something worth coming home to. It was Eli who told her about the competition. He came in from town on a Thursday afternoon. He'd gone in with the supply wagon, and he was buzzing with something he'd clearly been holding on to for the whole 4-mile ride back. Because he came through the kitchen door and put the flour sack down and said, almost before he'd cleared the threshold, Miss Mercer, there's a cooking competition. She looked up from the bread she was shaping. Is there? The Montana Frontier Cooking Competition. It's run by the Territorial Agricultural Society. It's been going 15 years. There's a prize $20 and a supply contract with one of the Bozeman hotels. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out. I got the notice from the board outside the general store. I thought you'd want to see it. She took the paper. Read it. The competition was in 6 weeks, open to all residents of the territory. Judged by a panel of 3 in categories of frontier cooking, baked goods, main dishes, and preserved foods. Why are you showing me this? She said. Eli looked at her like the answer was obvious. Because you'd win, he said. She put the notice down on the counter. You don't know that. I know that I have eaten bad food my entire life on this ranch, and I know what your food tastes like, he said. with the earnest directness of 19 years old when it's being completely sincere. And I know those aren't the same. She was quiet for a moment. The competition will have experienced cooks, she said. Women who've been entering for years. Families with resources. You don't need resources, Eli said. You need flour and time, and you've already got both. He picked up his flour sack. I just thought you should know about it, he said. More quietly. In case. He went out to the larder, and Adeline stood at the bread counter and looked at the folded notice. And she thought about $20 and a Bozeman Hotel supply contract. And she thought about Eleanor Aldridge's voice through the wall. And she thought about Mrs. Pullman's look on the main street of Willow Creek. She folded the notice and put it in her apron pocket. She didn't say anything about it that night, or the next. It was Pete who noticed. Pete Hadley noticed most things. She had learned, with the patient, accumulated attention of a man who had been watching people for a long time and had gotten good at reading the spaces between what they said. He came in Saturday morning for his coffee, earlier than usual, and stood at the window, and he said, without any preamble, "You're thinking about something." "I'm always thinking about something," she said. "Something specific," he said. "Something you haven't made up your mind about." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took the folded notice out of her apron pocket and put it on the counter in front of him. Pete read it. "Eli told you." "Eli showed me," she said. "There's a difference." "You'd win," Pete said. "That's what Eli said. Eli's 19 and doesn't know everything." "But he's right about this," Pete said. He picked up his cup. "The question isn't whether you'd win. The question is whether you're willing to walk into a room full of Willow Creek's finest and let them watch." She was quiet. "Because the cooking will be fine," Pete continued. "I've eaten your cooking for 2 weeks, and the cooking will be better than fine. But they'll be watching you walk in. They'll be watching how you carry yourself. They'll be watching what you do when they look at you the way they look at you." He set down the cup. "And then they'll taste the food. And they'll have to decide whether what they're seeing with their eyes or what they're tasting with their mouths them the truth." Adeline looked at him for a long moment. "That's a lot to put on a pie," she said. Pete almost smiled. "It's a frontier cooking competition," he said. "It's always been about more than the pie." She looked down at the notice in her hands. She thought about Cheyenne. She thought about Mrs. Hargrove's polite, careful voice explaining about image and presentation. She thought about the cook at the Hargrove who had been there before her, a man older, who had taught her the first year she was there that the best cooking came from the part of you that wasn't trying to impress anyone. "Cook like nobody's watching," he had told her, "because the food knows the difference." She folded the notice and put it back in her pocket. "I'll think about it," she said. Pete nodded. He drank his coffee. He went back to work. That night she took the notice out one more time and smoothed it on the table in her room and read it again in the lamplight. 6 weeks, open to all residents, $20 and a supply contract. She thought, a supply contract with a Bozeman hotel would mean a reference that has nothing to do with any ranch or any town that has already decided what I am. She thought, $20 is enough to stay solvent if something goes wrong. She thought, they're going to look at me when I walk in. She folded the notice, put it under her pillow, blew out the lamp. In the morning, she was going to ask Nathaniel Brooks if she could enter the Montana Frontier Cooking Competition. She picked a bad time to ask him. Not badly intentioned, she had planned to find him after the morning work and before the midday meal, when he was usually in the office doing his accounts and could be interrupted without disrupting anything. But when she knocked on the office door and opened it, she found him at the desk with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. Not the flat quiet, not the tired around the eyes quiet. Something harder, something that had gone past control and was being held together by considerable effort. "I can come back," she said immediately. "No." He set the letter down. pressed his hands flat on the desk for a moment. What is it? She hesitated. It can wait. Her first name from him. For the first time, he didn't seem to notice he'd used it. Tell me what you came to say. She told him about the competition. She did it quickly, concisely, the facts, the date, the prize, what she thought it could mean for her own standing. She did not make a case for why he should say yes. She presented it, and she stopped, and she waited. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter on his desk, and then he looked at her, and something in his face shifted from whatever it had been when she walked into something more present. What would you need, he said. Time on the days leading up to it for additional preparation, she said. I can still manage the ranch meals, I just need the evenings. That's not a problem, he said. And she stopped. Say it, he said. I don't know what the entry process involves. I've never entered a competition before. If there are fees, I can pay them from my wages, but I don't want I'll cover any fees, he said. It's a business investment. A ranch whose cook wins a territorial competition gets to say that. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm choosing to. He picked up the letter again, looked at it once. Set it back down. You should enter, he said. You'll win. You haven't even tasted everything I make, she said. I've tasted enough, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what's in the letter? He looked at her. For a moment she thought he was going to tell her it wasn't her business. Which would have been fair, and she would have left, without pressing it. Instead he said, the Aldridge family has informed the county commissioner that Brooks Ranch is conducting its business in a manner inconsistent with community standards. The commissioner's office is requesting a formal response. The air went out of the room. Because of me, she said. Because of Eleanor Aldridge, he said. She's found a more official channel than a social visit. Adeline stood very still. Nathaniel, if this becomes illegal or official, it won't, he said. The commissioner's office has no jurisdiction over my hiring decisions, and they know it. This is pressure, not process. They're testing whether formal language changes my answer. He looked at her steadily. It doesn't. It could escalate, she said. It could, he said. Are you telling me you want to leave? A long pause. No, she said. Then we're having the same conversation we already had, he said. I enter your name in the competition. You continue running my kitchen. And Eleanor Aldridge finds out that neither of us is as easy to move as she'd hoped. He picked up a pen. What's your full name for the registration form? She blinked. Adeline Ruth Mercer. Good, he said. I'll have Pete take the registration into town tomorrow. She stood in the office doorway for a moment. Not sure what she had expected from the conversation, but certain this wasn't it. Nathaniel, she said. He looked up. I'm going to win that competition, she said. I need you to know that I mean that. Not because it'll make the Aldridges look foolish. Though that won't trouble me. But because I need to win it for myself. He held her gaze. I know, he said. That's why I think you will. She went back to the kitchen. She had a midday meal to prepare, and she had 6 weeks to decide what she was going to make. The 6 weeks moved differently than the first 2 had. The first 2 weeks had been about establishing herself, proving to the men, to Nathaniel, to herself, that she could hold this position. The 6 weeks before the competition were something else. They had a goal in them, a direction, and that changed the texture of everything. She started experimenting in the evenings, after the kitchen was cleaned, and the men were settled in the bunkhouse, and the ranch had gone quiet. Small things at first, variations on the biscuit recipe. Adjustments to the herb ratios in the stew, a different method for the pastry she'd been working on that involved resting the dough longer in the cold air near the window. She kept notes on scraps of paper that she tucked into her grandmother's recipe box alongside the original cards. The ranch hands were, without quite understanding it, her test kitchen. What's different about the biscuits today, Cody said one morning. Not a complaint. Just a statement that something had changed. I rested the dough differently, she said. He chewed. Considered. It's better, he said. Don't change it back. Roy tried 3 different versions of her main dish over the course of a week and ranked them out loud and at length, which she found both useful and exhausting. Hatcher said nothing but always finished his plate, which she had come to understand was his version of a standing ovation. Eli asked questions, genuine ones, about technique and timing, about why certain things worked and others didn't, and she found that explaining things to him sharpened her own understanding of what she was doing. Nathaniel said nothing about the preparation, which was his way of saying everything was fine. On the evenings when she was working late on something experimental, he would sometimes come into the kitchen for his coffee and watch for a few minutes, not intrusively, not with any comment or evaluation, just present. In the way he was present, which she had stopped finding strange and started finding steadying. "You're not sleeping enough," he said one night, when she was still at the counter at 10 o'clock. "I'm sleeping fine," she said. "You were up before 4 this morning. How do you know that?" "Because the stove was already hot when I came down at 4:15, he said. "And you were in here." She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his coffee, looking at her with that direct, calm attention that she had stopped flinching at a week in and had started, more recently, to look for. "I had an idea about the pastry crust," she said. "I wanted to try it while it was cold enough in here. And it works," she said. "I think it's the best version I've made." He nodded. "Then it was worth it," he said. "But sleep tomorrow." "I will," she said. "I'll hold you to that," he said, and went back upstairs. And she listened to his boots on the steps and thought about a man who noticed what time she lit the stove in the morning and felt something she was not quite ready to name yet move in the vicinity of her chest. 3 weeks before the competition, the trouble arrived in a form she hadn't expected. She had known the Aldridge family's formal complaint to the commissioner had been dismissed. Nathaniel had told her matter-of-factly the week it happened, the same way he told her anything else of that nature. Once, directly, without drama, she had filed it in the part of her mind that held things she couldn't control and didn't intend to spend energy on. What she hadn't filed properly was Eleanor Aldridge herself. The woman came to the ranch alone this time. No social committee. No rehearsed posture. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Nathaniel was out in the far fields and wouldn't be back until near dark. And she came to the kitchen door, not the front door, and knocked. Adeline opened it. Eleanor Aldridge was a woman in her mid-40s with a composed, handsome face and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room. She was dressed well but not ostentatiously. She looked at Adeline the way a person looks at something they've spent a long time forming an opinion about and are now seeing in person for the first time. "Miss Mercer," she said. Adeline said, and did not move from the doorway. A pause. Eleanor seemed to have expected the door to open wider. She recalibrated. "I'd like to speak with you," she said. "You're speaking with me now," Adeline said. Another pause. Eleanor Aldridge, Adeline had understood by now, was a woman who operated by controlling the terms of encounters. And having those terms declined with pleasant steadiness was apparently not something her playbook had fully accounted for. "May I come in?" Eleanor said. Adeline stepped back. She let the woman in. She went back to the pot she'd been working on. She was not going to stop doing her work because someone wanted her attention, and she said, "What can I do for you, Mrs. Aldridge?" Eleanor stood in the middle of the kitchen. She looked around it not critically, Adeline thought, but with something more complicated, like someone trying to find something they expected to dislike and not quite finding it. "I came to ask you to withdraw from the competition," Eleanor said. The words landed flat and clear in the kitchen. Adeline kept stirring. "No," she said. "Miss Mercer, I've heard what you've been saying about me," Adeline said. "In town. At church. To the commissioner's office." I understand why you've said it. She turned from the stove and looked at Eleanor directly. I want you to understand something in return. I am not going to make myself smaller so that your opinion of this town's standards can stay comfortable. I have been doing that my entire life, and I have decided to stop. Eleanor's composure flickered not much. But enough. It isn't personal, she said. It always is, Adeline said. It's just that the people who make it personal prefer to believe otherwise. A long silence. Eleanor Aldridge looked at her, really looked at her. Maybe for the first time, not the evaluating, calculating look she'd come in with. Something more honest, and Adeline thought, more conflicted. You're going to enter that competition regardless of anything I say, Eleanor said. It came out as a statement, not a question. Yes, Adeline said. And you're going to stay on this ranch, regardless of anything the commissioner's office says. Yes, she said. And Nathaniel is going to let you, Eleanor said. And now something different was in her voice, something that might have been, under different circumstances, almost resigned. He already has, Adeline said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the pot on the stove. She looked at the organized shelves, things Adeline had spent a week and a half getting into proper order. She looked at the recipe box on the counter with its cracked lid. What happened to the box? She asked very quietly. Adeline looked at her. I set it down too hard on a counter, she said. In town, the day I arrived, Eleanor Aldridge looked at the box for another moment. Then she looked at Adeline, and the composed, rehearsed expression was gone just briefly. Just for a moment, and what was underneath was more complicated and more human than anything Adeline had expected to find there. I heard about what happened at the boarding house, Eleanor said. With Mrs. Pullman, Adeline said nothing. I'm not saying I agree with how you've been treated, Eleanor said. And the words came out with some difficulty, like they were navigating around something. I want to be clear about that. And yet you came here to ask me to withdraw from a cooking competition, Adeline said. The silence stretched between them. The Aldridge family has hosted the competition for 11 years, Eleanor said finally. My mother-in-law started it. It's important to us. To what we've built. I understand that, Adeline said. And I'm going to enter it. And I'm going to cook the best food I know how to cook. And then the judges will decide. She paused. If your family's competition can only be what it's meant to be when the right kind of person enters it, then maybe the problem isn't me. Eleanor stood there for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, You're a harder woman than I expected. I've had to be, Adeline said. You might consider that. Eleanor Aldridge straightened. She nodded once, not a concession, but something. An acknowledgement of some kind. She went to the kitchen door, opened it herself, and paused. The judges this year include Thomas Hartley from the Bozeman Gazette, she said. He writes about everything. He'll be there with a notebook. She paused. I'm not saying that to threaten you. What are you saying it for? Adeline said. A very long pause. I don't know, Eleanor said, and then she left. Adeline stood in her kitchen and looked at the closed door for a long moment. Then she turned back to the pot. She picked up the spoon. She finished what she'd been doing before the door had knocked. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. She thought about Thomas Hartley from the Bozeman Gazette writing about everything. She thought about a notebook and a story and what that could mean, good or bad, depending on what happened in that competition room and how she walked into it and whether the food said what she needed it to say. She thought about Nathaniel coming in from the far field at dark, tired, and how she was going to have to tell him Eleanor Aldridge had been here. She thought about his face when he heard that, and she thought about the way he always listened, actually listened, without interrupting, without leaping ahead to conclusions, and she thought that if she had to tell someone what Eleanor Aldridge had said to her and how it had ended, she was glad it was going to be him. She stirred the pot. 3 more weeks, and she knew what she was going to make. She told Nathaniel that evening. He came in from the far field at dusk the way he always did, boots on the porch. A pause at the washstand, then the sound of the back door and his presence filling the kitchen doorway in that particular quiet way of his. She had kept his supper warm. She had also kept the conversation in her head. Turning it over, deciding how much to say and in what order, because Nathaniel Brooks was a man who responded better to facts than to build-up, and she had learned to lead with the thing that mattered. "Eleanor Aldridge came here today," she said, before he'd even gotten to the coffee. "To the kitchen door. While you were out." He stopped. He looked at her. "What did she want?" "She asked me to withdraw from the competition." The quiet that followed was the hard kind. She watched him process it, the stillness that moved through him when something pushed against a line he'd already drawn. "And he said." "I told her no," Adeline said. "We talked for a few minutes." She left. He pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down, which was not what he usually did. Usually he stood at the counter with his coffee. The sitting down meant he was settling in for the whole of it. "Tell me what she said," he said. She told him. All of it, the kitchen door. The request, the conversation that had moved in directions she hadn't expected. And the thing Eleanor had said at the end, about Thomas Hartley, from the Bozeman Gazette and the notebook. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "She told you about Hartley," he said. "Yes." "That's interesting," he said. And he meant it. She could hear the genuine consideration in it. The turning over of something that didn't fit the pattern he'd established for Eleanor Aldridge. "I thought so too," she said. "Hartley's been critical of the Aldridge family before," Nathaniel said. "He wrote a piece 2 years ago about land consolidation in the county. The Aldridges didn't come out well." He looked at his coffee. "Eleanor telling you he'll be there with a notebook could mean she wants you warned. Or it could mean she wants you rattled. Or both," Adeline said. "Or both," he agreed. He looked at her. "Are you rattled?" She thought about it honestly. "Not the way she might have hoped," she said. "A journalist writing about the competition, about whatever happens at the competition that could go in directions I can't control. That part I don't love." "No," he said. "But you can't cook to the journalist. You cook to the food." She looked at him. "That's what my grandmother used to say." Not those words, but that. He nodded, like it confirmed something he already thought. "Then you already know what to do," he said. She did know. That was the thing she had always known. It was the space between knowing and believing it that kept narrowing. Day by day, in this kitchen, on this ranch, in the orbit of this quiet, stubborn, decent man who had told Eleanor Aldridge that the door was behind her and meant it without performance. "Nathaniel." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For all of it. I want you to know I understand what this has cost you, and I don't take it lightly." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw steady light. "It hasn't cost me anything I was unwilling to spend," he said. And then, before she could respond, he stood and took his plate to the counter and said, "The pastry you made last night. The men want to know if it's coming back." She almost laughed. "Saturday," she said. "Good," he said, and went upstairs. And she sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight for a while, not thinking about Eleanor Aldridge or Thomas Hartley or the competition 3 weeks away, but about the particular steadiness of a man who spoke plainly and meant what he said and didn't ask her to be any less than she was. That was all. That was enough. She banked the stove. She went to bed. She slept. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest she'd had since arriving at Brooks Ranch, not because anything went wrong, but because everything was building toward something, and she could feel the pressure of it in her hands when she cooked. In the quality of her sleep, in the way she found herself rechecking measurements she had made correctly on the first try. She had decided on 3 dishes for the competition. A slow-braised beef with wild herbs and bone broth, built the way her grandmother had built it, low and patient. coaxing the tough cuts into something that tasted like it came from a much better piece of meat than it actually did. A pan of biscuits so precisely calibrated by this point that she could have made them blindfolded. And the apple dessert, the cinnamon nutmeg one, that Eli had asked for on her second day. That the men now requested by name, that she had spent 6 weeks refining into something she believed was as good as she had ever made anything. Simple food. Honest food. The kind of food that didn't try to be anything other than what it was. Which was the only kind she had ever known how to make. She practiced the beef twice more in the evenings, adjusting the herb balance the second time, leaving it the same the third. The biscuits she made every morning, regardless, they didn't need more refinement. They needed her hands to know them so completely that nerves on the day of the competition wouldn't be able to touch the muscles memory. The apple dessert she made once more on the Friday before the competition and stood over it while it finished, smelling the cinnamon and nutmeg filling the kitchen. And she thought about her grandmother's hands on the same recipe and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Eli came in while she was standing there. "Is it ready?" he asked, looking at the pan with unconcealed hope. "Not yet," she said. He sat down at the small table and waited, which was the most patient she had ever seen him, which told her something about the power of cinnamon and nutmeg on a cold Montana evening. "Are you scared?" he asked after a while. She considered lying. She decided against it. "Some about the cooking?" "No," she said. "The cooking will be fine. About walking in there." She paused. "There are people in that room who have decided what they think of me before I put a single dish in front of them. And I'm going to have to walk in anyway and look like I don't need their approval." "You don't need it," Eli said. "I know that," she said. "The trick is making my body believe it at the same time my head does." She looked at him. "You ever been somewhere you knew you weren't supposed to be?" According to everyone else in the room, Eli looked at his hands. "My whole life," he said quietly. She looked at him. It was the first time he'd said anything like that. And she understood immediately that he meant it, and she understood what kind of 19 years could produce that answer. "Then you know," she said. "You know that you go in anyway. And you do the work, and you let the work be what it is." Eli nodded. He looked up at her. "You're gonna be the best thing in that room," he said. "The food and everything else." She took the apple dessert out of the oven. She cut a piece for Eli and put it in front of him and watched him take the first bite and close his eyes. And she thought, yes, that's what it should taste like. And she felt, underneath the nerves of Hampshire and the long road that had brought her to a ranch kitchen in Montana, something that was close to ready. The morning of the competition arrived with cold, clear air and the kind of sky that didn't apologize for anything. She was up at 3:30. She was not going to be late. She was not going to be rushed. She was not going to walk into that building carrying the energy of someone who had been scrambling. She was going to walk in steady. Because steady was the only thing she knew how to be when it mattered. She had the kitchen organized by 4. Her ingredients were portioned and wrapped. Her tools were cleaned and packed. She had made a checklist the night before, not because she needed it, but because the making of it had been calming, the act of putting everything in order on paper, so her mind didn't have to hold it all at once. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 4:15 with his coat on. "You don't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "The wagon's hitched." She stopped, looked at him. He met her gaze with that level, steady attention. And she understood that this was not a conversation he was going to have at 4 in the morning, not because he didn't have things to say, but because the wagon being hitched said the thing that needed to be said. And he was not a man who saw the point in repeating himself with words when he had already said it with action. She picked up her box. "All right," she said. Cody was at the barn door when they came out, hands in his coat pockets. He looked at her and nodded once. The way Cody communicated things he wasn't going to say out loud. and she nodded back, and they understood each other. Pete was there too, leaning against the fence post nearest the wagon. And he said, "Good luck, Miss Mercer," in the tone of someone who didn't think luck was the relevant variable. Eli appeared from around the side of the barn, slightly breathless. Hair uncombed, clearly having gotten up too fast. "I wanted to see you off," he said. "You needed sleep," she said. "I'll sleep later," he said. He looked at her for a moment with those 19-year-old eyes that saw things more directly than most people twice his age. "You're ready," he said. "You've been ready." She put her free hand briefly on his shoulder, just for a moment, and then she climbed up onto the wagon, and Nathaniel climbed up beside her, and they drove the 4 miles into Willow Creek in the quiet before the town woke up. And she held her recipe box in her lap and watched the dark sky begin, very slowly, to show the first gray edge of morning. Neither of them spoke for most of the ride. That was fine. She had noticed, over the weeks, that the silences between them had stopped being the cautious kind, the kind where you're not speaking because you're deciding what's safe to say, and had become the kind where you're not speaking because nothing needs to be said, and the other person's presence is company enough. She didn't have a lot of experience with that particular kind of silence. It had taken her a while to recognize it for what it was. When the lights of Willow Creek came into view, Nathaniel said, "Whatever happens in there, I know," she said. A pause. "Do you?" She looked at him. In the early morning dark, with the town coming toward them, his face was quieter than usual, which for him was saying something. He was looking at the road, not at her, but there was something in the set of his expression that she had learned meant he was working something out. "I know the ranch is behind me regardless," she said. "I know you mean that. I mean more than that," he said. And then he didn't say anything else, and she didn't ask. Because the wagon had reached the edge of town, and the moment had passed into the morning. And there was a competition to walk into. The Willow Creek Town Hall had been transformed for the day. She didn't look at the people. She looked at the cook stations, 12 of them, each with a stove and a work surface and a shelf. She looked at the judge's table at the far end of the room, where 3 chairs sat empty and waiting. She looked at the station she'd been assigned, number 7, which was neither near the door nor near the judges, and which suited her perfectly. Then she looked at the people, because she had to know what she was walking into. There were other competitors, most of them women. Most of them from the county's established families. Most of them setting up their stations with the comfortable efficiency of people who had done this before. She recognized a few faces from the general store, from the main street. She felt the looks when she came in, felt them the way you feel temperature. Not by looking for it, but by the change in the air. One woman stopped unpacking her crate entirely and watched Adeline cross the room. Another leaned to the woman next to her and said something quietly, and the other woman looked. Adeline set her box on the counter at Station 7. She opened it. She began to unpack. She heard someone approach from her left, and she straightened to find a woman about her own age, maybe a few years older, with a plain, direct face and the calm bearing of someone who didn't spend much time worrying about impressions. She was setting up at Station 8. "Ruth Calloway," the woman said, and extended her hand. "Adeline Merce," said, and shook it. "I heard about you," Ruth said. "You're the cook at Brooks Ranch." "I am." Ruth nodded. "My husband's brother worked for Brooks 6 years ago. Said it was the fairest outfit he'd ever been with." She glanced around the room and then back at Adeline with a look that managed to convey, in about a second and a half, that she was aware of the looks Adeline was getting and had no patience for them. "What are you making?" she said. "Braised beef, biscuits, and apple dessert," Adeline said. Ruth nodded like this was a serious answer deserving serious consideration. "The biscuits are where they'll judge you hardest," she said. "The women who've been entering for years, they have their biscuit recipes locked down. But you'll need yours to be different, not just good. Mine are different. Adeline said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Good, she said. And went back to her own unpacking. And just like that, Adeline had a neighbor at Station 8 who wasn't looking at her size. She filed that away and began to work. The competition began at 9 o'clock. The judges were introduced a woman named Clara Hooper, who ran a well-regarded boarding house in Bozeman, a rancher named George Finch, who served on the Territorial Agricultural Society, and Thomas Hartley from the Bozeman Gazette, who was younger than she'd expected. With a sharp face and the quiet attention of someone who was always listening for the thing underneath, the thing being said. Hartley's gaze moved across the room when he was introduced and stopped briefly, but unmistakably on Station 7. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her work surface. She was not going to spend today worrying about a journalist. She was going to cook. The first hour was controlled chaos, 12 people doing complicated things in close proximity. The smell of a dozen different dishes building in the room. The low urgent sounds of work being done seriously. She moved through her preparations the way she had practiced them, letting her hands lead, keeping her attention on the food and not on the people watching from the chairs along the wall. Because there were people watching from the chairs along the wall, and among them she had identified, without looking for her, Eleanor Aldridge. Eleanor was seated midway back on the left side, with two women from the social committee beside her. She was watching the room with the composed attention of a woman who had a stake in the outcome, which she did 11 years of her family's competition. She had not looked directly at Station 7 yet, or if she had, she'd been careful about it. Adeline put Eleanor out of her mind. She put the beef on low and let it work. She mixed the biscuit dough with the precision of someone who had made this recipe 300 times and knew every variable in it. She began preparing the apples. At the 90-minute mark, the smell from her station had changed. The beef was doing what it always did when she got the temperature right, releasing something deep and rich into the air. The kind of smell that made people stop mid-conversation without quite knowing why they'd stopped. She felt it happen in the room around her, a shift in the ambient noise. A pause, a turning of heads. Ruth Calloway at Station 8 glanced over and said quietly, "That's a good smell." "Thank you," Adeline said. "What's in the broth?" "Bones," Adeline said. "And time." Ruth made a sound of professional appreciation and went back to her own work. The biscuits went in 20 minutes before the judging time. Adeline had timed it exactly. She needed them to come out of the oven with about 8 minutes to rest before they were plated. Because biscuits that were still oven hot when they were plated could sweat on the surface and lose the crust. And her biscuit's crust was not something she was willing to lose. She watched the oven the way she always watched the oven, not staring at it, but keeping it in the edge of her attention, the way you kept anything important, just where you could see it. At the 8-minute mark, she opened the oven and looked at the biscuits and felt, in the way you felt things you'd worked hard enough to trust, that they were exactly right. She plated everything with the same attention she gave to every meal she made. Not to impress, not to perform, because the food deserved to be presented with care, and the people eating it deserved to see that care in the presentation. When the bell rang for judging to begin, she stepped back from her station and stood with her hands quiet at her sides. The judges moved through the stations one at a time. Beginning at the far end, she watched them work. Clara Hooper with her precise, experienced assessments, George Finch with his more practical and direct approach, Thomas Hartley writing in his notebook constantly, watching the competitors as much as the food. By the time they reached Station 7, she had been waiting for 25 minutes. She watched them approach. She kept her face neutral and her breathing even. Clara Hooper reached the beef first. She took the portion Adeline had plated. She smelled it before she tasted it. That was the sign of a real cook. Adeline had always thought, someone who trusted their nose to tell them something. She tasted it. She was still for a moment. She tasted it again. She did not write anything immediately. That meant something. Adeline thought with the other stations. Clara had written notes as she tasted. The pause before writing meant the thinking was more complex. George Finch tried the biscuit. He broke it in half first. The way people did when they knew what they were looking at, checking the interior structure. The rise, the way the layers had developed. He chewed. He looked at Adeline. "You rested this dough," he said. Not a question. He nodded slowly. "Changes the texture," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. "Considerably," he said, and wrote in his notebook. Thomas Hartley tried the apple dessert. He was quiet for longer than the others had been quiet at any station she'd watched. When he looked up, he wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at her. "How long have you been cooking?" he asked. "Since I was 7, she said. "My grandmother taught me." "And the recipe is hers?" "The foundation," she said. "The current version is mine." He wrote something. He looked up again. "You're the new cook at Brooks Ranch," he said. "Yes," she said. He paused in his writing. He looked at her for a moment with that listening for something expression. "There's been some discussion in the county about your position there," he said. Carefully. "I'm aware," she said. "Does that affect how you cook?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I cook for the people eating the food. That's all it's ever been." Hartley looked at her for a moment longer. Then he wrote something, a longer entry than the ones before it. They moved on to Station 8, and Adeline breathed. And waited. The deliberation took 40 minutes. 40 minutes was a long time to stand in a room where she was aware of every look that came her way. Every whispered conversation that paused when she glanced in its direction. She stayed at her station. She did not pace. She did not seek out Nathaniel in the chairs against the wall. Though she knew he was there, because she had seen him come in an hour into the judging and take a seat near the back without making anything of it. Ruth Calloway appeared at her elbow at the 20-minute mark. "How are you doing?" she said. "Fine," Adeline said. "Liar," Ruth said pleasantly. "But a composed one." "Which is better?" She looked at the judge's table. "Hartley's writing a lot," she said. "He only writes a lot when something surprised him. Is that good?" Adeline said. "With Hartley?" Ruth said. "Almost always." Eleanor Aldridge crossed the room at the 30-minute mark. Adeline saw her coming and braced herself, not visibly. Just internally, the way you braced for things you'd already decided to absorb. But Eleanor didn't come to her. Eleanor went to the judge's table and spoke briefly to Clara Hooper. And whatever she said was quiet and brief, and Clara Hooper's expression didn't change much. And then Eleanor walked back to her seat, and Adeline unclenched something in her jaw. Ruth had seen it, too. What was that? "I don't know," Adeline said. "I don't think it was good," Ruth said. "No," Adeline said. "I don't think so either." She stood and waited and kept her face neutral. And inside her chest, something was working very hard at being steady and not quite managing it as effortlessly as she would have liked. And then the bell rang, and the judges returned to their table. And Clara Hooper stood up. Clara Hooper was a woman who understood that people came to these things for a decision and not a speech. And Adeline liked her for it immediately. She thanked the competitors, thanked the organizers, made 2 sentences of commentary on the general quality of the entries this year, and then opened the envelope. "Third place," Clara said. "Ruth Calloway, Station 8. Ruth exhaled quietly beside her. "Well," she said to no one in particular. "Second place," Clara said. And Adeline felt the room tighten around her, felt the collective attention narrow. "Mrs. Virginia Marsh, Station 3. The room murmured. Adeline did not move, and "First place," Clara said. And the room was completely silent, the kind of silence that meant everyone was looking at the same thing at the same time. And Adeline became aware, in the periphery of her vision, of Nathaniel sitting very still in his chair at the back of the room. Adeline Mercer. Station 7. For one full second, nothing happened. Then Ruth Calloway said yes, in a tone of complete satisfaction. And someone in the chair started clapping. And the room came apart in the complicated way rooms come apart when something has happened that some people wanted and some people didn't, and everyone is trying to figure out what their face is supposed to be doing. Adeline stood at Station 7 and breathed. She heard applause genuine from some directions, polite from others, conspicuously absent from a few. She heard a woman's voice say something she couldn't make out, and another voice answer it. She heard Thomas Hartley's pen moving on his notepad. She walked to the judge's table the way she had walked up the road to Brooks Ranch 7 weeks ago, straight. Not fast, not performing composure, but actually having it. Because she was too much inside the moment to perform anything. Clara Hooper shook her hand and said, "The beef was extraordinary. The patience in it." George Finch shook her hand and said, "Best biscuit in the territory. I'll say that in public." Thomas Hartley shook her hand last and didn't say anything at all, just looked at her with that attending expression and kept his notebook closed. Which she understood meant the story he was writing was the one he was watching, not the one he'd finished. She turned from the judge's table and found herself face to face with Eleanor Aldridge. The room had not gotten quiet again. There was still the noise of a crowd processing something, of conversation starting and stopping. But between Adeline and Eleanor, there was a particular kind of stillness. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "The beef," she said. "Finally. My husband's mother used to make it that way. The bone broth, the low heat." She paused. "I didn't think anyone still knew how to do it." Adeline said nothing. She was waiting to understand what this was. "I came to speak to Clara Hooper during the deliberation," Eleanor said. "I want you to know that. I want you to know what I said to her." Adeline waited. "I told her that there had been some community discussion about one of the competitors," Eleanor said, "and that the discussion should not affect the judging." She held Adeline's gaze. "I told her that the competition's integrity required that the best food win regardless of anything else." The room moved around them. Adeline felt it the way you felt something that rearranged a thing you thought you understood. "Why?" she said. Eleanor looked at her with an expression that had several things in it at once, none of them simple. "Because you were right," she said quietly. "In my kitchen." "What you said. About a competition that can only be what it's meant to be when the right kind of person enters it." She paused. "It took me 3 weeks to admit that to myself." Adeline looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. A brief, real nod. And then she turned and walked back to the women she'd come with. And Adeline stood where she was for a moment, holding the weight of what had just happened, trying to take its measure. Then she felt a presence beside her, solid, quiet, the particular quality of stillness she'd have known, with her eyes closed by now, and she looked up and found Nathaniel standing there. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that first evening in the kitchen when she'd told him the stew had thyme in it. Like he was seeing something that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You won," he said. "The beef," he said. "And the biscuits," she said. A pause. "And the apple dessert?" "Apparently," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The room was still busy around them, people talking. The sound of the crowd doing the complicated thing crowds did after something unexpected. In the middle of it, Nathaniel Brooks stood very still and looked at Adeline Mercer with an expression that was most unguarded she had ever seen on his face. "When the reporter asked you about the ranch," he said, "I was close enough to hear." "What did you hear?" she said. "You said you cook for the people eating the food," he said. "That's all it's ever been." "That's true," she said. "I know," he said. "I've watched you do it for 7 weeks." She looked at him. The noise of the room around them seemed, for a moment, to belong to somewhere else entirely. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're looking at me differently than you usually do," she said. He held her gaze. He didn't look away. He didn't explain himself. He just let it stand, the way he let all his real statements stand plainly. Without decoration, for her to do with what she would. She looked at him for a long moment. Then Thomas Hartley appeared at her elbow with his notebook open. And the moment folded itself away, to somewhere private. And she turned to face whatever came next. Hartley looked between her and Nathaniel. "I'd like to ask you both some questions," he said. "If you're willing." "About the food?" Adeline said. "About the food," Hartley said, "and about everything else." Thomas Hartley asked his questions, the way good journalists asked questions, not pushing toward a predetermined answer, but opening space and seeing what filled it. He talked to Adeline for about 15 minutes at the edge of the competition room, while the crowd around them slowly thinned. People gathering their things and moving toward the door. The noise level dropping by degrees until their corner of the room felt almost private. He asked about her training. She told him about her grandmother, about the hotel in Cheyenne, about the years of working in kitchens where she was either invisible or inconvenient. Never simply a cook who was good at her job, she told it plainly. Without self-pity, because self-pity had never been something she had time for, and she wasn't going to start performing it for a journalist. He asked about the ranch. She told him what was true, that Nathaniel Brooks had offered her a fair trial when every door in Willow Creek had closed. That the work was good, that the men were honest, that she had found in that kitchen something she hadn't had in years, which was the simple dignity of being judged by what she produced and nothing else. Hartley wrote steadily through all of it. He was not dramatic about his reactions, he didn't perform surprise or sympathy, but she could tell when something landed by the way his pen moved faster. Then he asked about the community response, and she was careful. "There are people in this county who have opinions about my position at Brooks Ranch," she said. "That's their right. I'm not interested in arguing with opinions. I'm interested in doing my job." "And the formal complaint to the commissioner's office?" Hartley said. And she understood then that he had done his research before today, that the notebook had been open before he ever walked into this building. She glanced at Nathaniel, who was standing a few feet away, giving the appearance of looking at something else entirely while being. She was completely certain, listening to every word. "That complaint was dismissed," she said, "because it had no legal standing." Which is the appropriate outcome when someone tries to use official channels to regulate who a private ranch owner chooses to employ. "And Mr. Brooks?" Hartley said. "Can I ask him directly?" Nathaniel turned from whatever he'd been pretending to look at. "You can," he said. Hartley looked at him steadily. Why hire her when the community pressure was what it was from the start? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of someone choosing their words carefully for an audience, just the natural pause of a man who thought before he spoke. "Because Pete Hadley recommended her," he said. "And Pete doesn't recommend people for sport." He paused. "And because she told me in the first conversation that she needed me to judge her cooking and not her size. And I thought that was a reasonable thing to ask," Hartley wrote. And now, 7 weeks later, Nathaniel looked at Adeline a brief, direct look and then back at Hartley. "Now I know I made the right call," he said. "The food is excellent. The men are well. The ranch is running better than it has in 2 years. He held Hartley's gaze. "That's the complete account." Hartley looked at him for a moment with that listening expression. Then he nodded, closed his notebook partly, and said, "Miss Mercer, for the record, the people who have been making your situation in this county difficult, do you have anything you'd like to say?" She looked at him. She thought about it honestly, not performing consideration, but actually thinking about what was true and what was worth saying. "I'd like to say that good food doesn't care who made it," she said. "And that a community that decides in advance who's allowed to be excellent is a community that's going to miss a great deal of excellence." She paused. "That's all." Hartley wrote it down. He thanked them both. He moved away through the thinning crowd, and Adeline watched him go and thought about the story he was going to write, and what it would say, and who would read it, and decided that she had said what was true, and that was the only thing within her control. Ruth Calloway appeared at her elbow to say goodbye, a firm handshake and a card with her address on it, and an invitation to correspond, which Adeline accepted with genuine warmth, because Ruth Calloway was the kind of person you didn't find often and didn't let go of when you did. And then it was just Adeline and Nathaniel in the emptying room, and her recipe box on the counter at Station 7, and the remnants of 3 dishes that had just won the Montana Frontier Cooking Competition. "Ready?" Nathaniel said. "Yes," she said, and picked up her box. And they walked out into the Montana afternoon together. The ride home was different from the ride in. The morning ride had been full of the compressed tension of something approaching, the particular quiet of 2 people moving toward an event they couldn't fully predict. The afternoon ride was something else. The tension had released. The day had given its verdict, and what was left was the wide October countryside and the wagon moving through it, and a silence between them that had shifted into something she didn't quite have a word for yet. She was aware of him beside her in a way she had been aware of him for weeks, but had been careful not to examine too directly. She was aware of the way he drove, not inattentive, not careless, but with the easy competence of someone who had done a thing so many times it had stopped requiring his full attention. She was aware that he had come to the competition without being asked and had sat in the back of the room and said almost nothing, and that his presence had been, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, the thing that held the room steady for her. "What you said to Hartley," she said after a while. "Which part?" he said. "The part about Pete," she said. "And about judging the cooking and not the size." She paused. "You made it sound very practical." "It was practical," he said. "Was it?" she said. The wagon moved. "Partly," he said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but the corner of his jaw shifted in the way she had learned, meant he was working something out. "What's the other part?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The morning you arrived, what you needed from me." He paused. "I had been running this ranch by myself for 4 years. Not just without a cook. Without," he started again. "A ranch doesn't run on cattle alone. It runs on whether the people in it believe someone thinks they're worth looking after." He looked at her, then brief, direct. "You understood that before you'd been here an hour." I recognized it. She held that for a moment. "That's still practical," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." Another pause. "But I also just wanted you to stay," he said. Quietly, without drama, the way he said all the things that mattered. "The first morning after you cooked, I came to the door and I saw the men at that table. And I thought I'd like to see that again tomorrow. And the day after." He paused. "It took me a while to understand that it wasn't just about the food." The wagon moved through the quiet afternoon. She looked at the road ahead of them. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes. How long have you understood that it wasn't just about the food?" A long pause. "A while," he said. "How long is a while?" she said. He looked at her again. This time he held it, not the brief glance of a man checking something, but the longer, steadier look of a man who had decided to stop being careful about what he let show. "The afternoon you told me you weren't going to make yourself smaller anymore," he said. "In the kitchen, when you said you'd been doing it your whole life and you'd decided to stop." He paused. "That was the moment I stopped pretending I was only interested in a good cook." She looked at him for a long moment. "That was 6 weeks ago," she said. "Yes," he said. "You didn't say anything for 6 weeks," she said. "No," he said. He looked back at the road. "Because you were building something," he said. "Because the competition was coming and you needed to be building it without anything else in the way." "Because I wasn't sure you were," he stopped. "Wasn't sure I was what?" she said. "Wasn't sure you were staying," he said, simply, without self-protection. You'd been pushed out of enough places. I didn't know if winning this competition would make you want to stay here, or want to see what else was possible somewhere else. And I wasn't going to put something on you that might make leaving harder if leaving was what you needed. She sat with that for a long time. The wagon rolled. The afternoon light moved. That's, she said. And stopped. What? He said. That's one of the kindest things anyone has ever not said to me, she said. He looked at her. And this time the thing in his face that had been the ghost of a smile for 7 weeks arrived in full, not a large expression, not a performed one, just a real and quiet warmth that changed his face completely and that she had the thought she would very much like to see again many more times. I'm staying. He held her gaze. I know, he said. You just told me. I'm telling you clearly, she said. Because you tend to respond better to clear statements than to anything else. That's accurate, he said. So, she said, I'm staying. And whatever you were about to not say for another 6 weeks, you can say it. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he looked back at the road, and she could see him working something out, not avoiding it. Just finding the right words, the way he always did. Not yet, he said. She blinked. Not yet? I want to say it right, he said. And not on a wagon on a dirt road after a long day. He paused. Give me until the weekend. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You are the most deliberate man I have ever met. Yes, ma'am, he said. With that quiet warmth still in his face, I've been told. She shook her head. And something in her chest was doing something she hadn't felt in years. Light. And warm. And a little terrifying. In the way that good things were terrifying when you hadn't had them in a while and weren't sure yet how much you were allowed to trust them. She looked at the road ahead. She held her recipe box in her lap. The ranch came into view, and the men were in the yard. And when Cody saw the wagon, he straightened up from what he'd been doing and waited. And when they pulled in and she stepped down, he looked at her face, and then at Nathaniel's face, and then he nodded once that Cody nod that was his entire emotional vocabulary, and said, Well, first place, she said. Cody uncrossed his arms. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the contained approval of a man who didn't show things easily, but something more open, more genuine. Good, he said. And then, with feeling, louder than she'd ever heard him say anything, Eli came out of the barn at a run. Saw her face and said, You won. First place, she said. He made a sound like someone who had been holding their breath for 7 weeks and had finally been allowed to exhale. He grabbed her hand and shook it so enthusiastically that she laughed out loud, a real laugh. From somewhere deep, the kind she hadn't heard herself make in a long time, and Pete appeared from around the corner and said, Told you, in the tone of a man who had never doubted it. And Roy appeared from the bunkhouse and said, You're making the apple thing tonight. Right? And the yard came alive with the noise of 12 working men who had a reason to feel good about the place they worked. And Adeline stood in the middle of it and felt very specifically like a person who had come home. The article ran in the Bozeman Gazette 4 days later. Pete brought it in from town on a Thursday afternoon and put it on the kitchen table without saying anything, which was how she knew it was significant. She dried her hands and sat down and read it. Thomas Hartley had written a long piece, not just about the competition about the county, about the patterns of who got to compete and who got to win and who got told before they walked in the door that the room wasn't for them. He had written about Adeline's history in Cheyenne, about the doors that had closed in Willow Creek, about the formal complaint to the commissioner's office and its dismissal. He had written about Nathaniel's hiring decision and what it had required in terms of weathering community pressure. He had written about Eleanor Aldridge going to Clara Hooper during the deliberations to protect the integrity of the judging, which Adeline had not expected him to include, and which complicated the picture of Eleanor in a way she thought was probably accurate. And he had quoted her, "Good food doesn't care who made it." A community that decides in advance who's allowed to be excellent is going to miss a great deal of excellence. She read the article twice. She sat with it. Then she looked up and found Nathaniel in the doorway. He had come in quietly, which was the only way he came in anywhere, and from his expression she could see he had already read it. "He quoted you accurately," Nathaniel said. "Yes," she said. "He was fair about the ranch," he said. "And about the Aldridges. More than fair," she said. "He could have made Eleanor the villain. He didn't." "She wasn't," Nathaniel said. "Not entirely." "No," she said. "Not entirely." He came in and sat at the table across from her. He looked at the newspaper for a moment, then at her. "This is going to change some things," he said. "I know," she said. "The hotel in Bozeman that offers the supply contract, they'll be in touch about the terms," he said. "That's yours. That's your contract, not the ranch's. I was going to ask you about that," she said. "Whether that was a conflict, it's not," he said. "The hotel serves different markets than I deal with. And having a cook here who holds a recognized Bozeman supply contract makes the ranch more credible. Not less." He paused. "I intend to," she said. He nodded. He looked at the paper again. "Then there's something else." She waited. "Two ranchers from the south end of the county sent word this morning," he said. "They want to discuss supply arrangements. A restaurant owner in Billings sent a letter asking who's managing the ranch kitchen." He paused. "One of the county commissioners sent a note." She looked at him. "What kind of note?" "An apologetic one," he said. And the flatness of his delivery made it clear what he thought of the commissioner's timing. She took that in. "The article did that in one day," she said. "People move fast when the direction of the wind is clear," Nathaniel said. He held her gaze. "I want you to know something. Any of this that brings you opportunity beyond this ranch, I'm not going to hold that against you or use it as reason to adjust our arrangement. You've earned whatever this opens." She looked at him steadily. "You told me on the wagon that you wanted me to stay," she said. "I did," he said. "I stand by that. But wanting something from you doesn't mean I get to limit what's available to you. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said, "genuinely unlike most men I have known." "I'll take that," he said. "You should," she said. The afternoon moved around them. The kitchen warm and steady, and they sat at the table with the newspaper between them and drank their coffee and talked through the practical questions, the Bozeman contract terms, the supply inquiries, what the increased attention to the ranch meant for staffing and purchasing, and the fall season. It was a practical conversation, and a real one, and underneath it was the other thing. The thing he had said on the wagon, the thing she had said back. And neither of them addressed it directly, because they had both agreed, without agreeing out loud, that it was for the weekend. And it was still Thursday. She was fine with Thursday. She had waited this long to feel this way. She could wait until Saturday. Friday brought a visitor she hadn't expected. She was in the kitchen mid-morning when she heard a rider come into the yard. She didn't go to look. Not her habit. She had learned to let the men handle the yard and focus on the kitchen. But when Cody appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, she put down what she was doing. "Someone to see you," Cody said. "Out front." "Who?" Cody seemed to consider how to describe the. "A woman," he said. "From town. She says she has something she needs to say to you." Adeline wiped her hands. She went to the front door and opened it. Mrs. Pullman was standing on the porch. The woman from the boarding house, the first door that had closed in Willow Creek. The one with the standard of appearance and the polite decline and the expression that had said everything her words hadn't. She was standing on the porch of Brooks Ranch with her hands folded in front of her and an expression that was difficult to read and that appeared to be costing her something. Adeline stood in the doorway and waited. "I read the article, Mrs. Pullman said. "All right," Adeline said. "I wanted to come and say, Mrs. Pullman stopped. Started again. "I want to say that I made a mistake. When you came to my establishment, The way what I said about presentation. And she stopped again. Her composure was intact, but it was working harder than usual. I handled it badly, she said, and I'm sorry for it. Adeline looked at her for a long moment. Thank you for coming, she said. I know that wasn't easy. No, Mrs. Pullman said. It wasn't. She paused. The article said you make the best biscuits in the territory. George Finch said that, Adeline said. I didn't disagree. Something shifted in Mrs. Pullman's face, not quite a smile. But the relative of one. I don't doubt it, she said. She looked at Adeline for another moment. I hope you're well here, she said. I genuinely mean that. I am, Adeline said. Mrs. Pullman nodded. She turned to go and then paused. And said quietly, without looking back, my grandmother was a large woman. Excellent cook. She spent her whole life being told she didn't look the part. She paused. I should have remembered that when you knocked on my door. She went down the porch steps and mounted her horse and rode back toward town. And Adeline stood in the doorway and watched her go and felt the complicated, layered thing that happened when someone surprised you just enough to make you reconsider the story you'd been telling yourself about them. She went back to the kitchen. She had biscuits to make. She made them the way she always made them, precisely. Patiently, with the full attention of someone who believed that what you put into a thing came through in what came out of it. They were, as usual, very good. Saturday came the way Nathaniel had said it would, deliberately. She had spent the day cooking, which was what she did with days that had something waiting in them. The cooking gave her hands somewhere to be, and her attention something to organize itself around. And it produced results that were tangible and real in a way that anticipation was not. She made the apple dessert, not because she planned to use it for anything in particular, because her hands wanted something familiar, and the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg was the smell of things being all right. The evening came on slowly, the way October evenings did, the light going orange and then going. The air sharpening, the ranch settling into the particular quiet of a day's work finished and the night not yet begun. The men were in the bunkhouse. Pete was doing a last walk of the horses, which was his nightly ritual and had been for 12 years. The kitchen was clean. Nathaniel came in at 7:30. She was at the table with her grandmother's recipe box open in front of her. She'd been organizing the cards, adding the new ones she'd made during the weeks of competition preparation, putting them in the system her grandmother had devised. By season and by what you had. It was quiet work. It felt like the right kind of work for a Saturday evening. He sat down across from her. She looked up. He looked at the recipe box, and then at her, and he said, I want to say something. All right, she said. She put her hands flat on the table and gave him her full attention, because that was what he deserved when he was working himself up to something. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, the unguarded look, the one that had showed up at the competition and hadn't fully gone away since. I have been living in this house for 4 years by myself, he said. Since Margaret died, and I had convinced myself that was the appropriate thing. That the ranch was enough, that the work was enough. He paused. I wasn't miserable. I want to be accurate about that. I was running the ranch and doing it well, and the men were fine and the operation was sound. He looked at her hands on the table and then back at her face. But I had stopped expecting anything. I hadn't noticed I'd stopped until the morning after your first meal. When I came to the kitchen door and I heard those men laughing, she held very still. I stood there, he said, and I thought I had forgotten what this sounds like. And then I thought she did that. That woman who asked to be judged on her cooking did that in one evening. He paused. And then I walked away because I didn't know what to do with that yet. The kitchen was very quiet. Nathaniel, she said. Let me finish, he said. I've been working on this for a while and I'd like to get it out. She almost smiled. Go ahead, she said. I am not a man who says things I don't mean, he said. You've had enough time around me to know that's true. So when I say that the past 7 weeks have been, he stopped. that you have made this place into something I didn't know it could still be. I need you to understand. I mean that with everything I have." He looked at her steadily. "And I need you to understand that when I say I would like you to stay here, not as the cook, not just as the cook, but as something more than that. I am saying it because it is the truest thing I can think of right now." Adeline looked at him across the kitchen table, with the recipe box between them and the lamplight steady and the October night quiet outside. "Nathaniel Brooks," she said, "are you telling me you love me?" He held her gaze. "I'm telling you, I'm headed there at considerable speed," he said. "And I wanted you to know before I got there, so you had time to decide what you think about it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Willow Creek carrying a cracked recipe box and a lifetime of closed doors. She thought about how long she had carried the belief absorbed from years of being told it in 100 different ways that wanting to be loved was a luxury that wasn't available to a woman like her. That she was too large, too plain, too much. She thought about a man who had said their loss in a tone that meant it. "I'm not afraid of where you're headed," she said. "I should tell you that clearly." Something happened in his face, the guard that was always there, professional and careful, came down all at once, and what was underneath it was not complicated. It was just real. Good. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his briefly, firmly, the way people touched things they meant to keep. "Good," she said back. He turned his hand over and held hers. Just for a moment. Just long enough for both of them to understand that something had crossed from one place to another and wasn't going back. Then Pete knocked on the back door to report on the horses, and the moment ended in the practical way that moments on a working ranch ended. And Nathaniel went to talk to Pete, and Adeline cut 2 pieces of the apple dessert and put them on plates. And when Nathaniel came back in from the porch, she pushed 1 plate across the table to him and sat down with her own. He tasted it. He was quiet for a moment. "This is the best version you've made," he said. "I know," she said. "What's different?" She thought about it honestly. "I think I wasn't nervous when I made it," she said. "I think that's the variable I've been missing." He looked at her across the table. "You weren't nervous tonight?" "No," she said. "Not tonight." He held her gaze with that quiet warmth that had stopped hiding itself. "Good," he said, for the 3rd time that evening, and ate his dessert. And the kitchen, which had been cold and empty and purposeless not so long ago, was warm and full and exactly what a kitchen was supposed to be. The week after Saturday moved differently than any week before it. Not dramatically. Not in ways that the men at the ranch would have been able to name if asked. But Adeline felt it, the way the kitchen felt different when you knew what was in the room next door. The way a conversation carried more weight when you understood something had shifted underneath it. Nathaniel was still Nathaniel, contained, deliberate. Present in the way he was always present, but there was a looseness to the edges now. Something that hadn't been there before. He looked at her longer when he came in for his coffee. He said her name more often than he needed to. Small things. Real things. She did not make too much of them. She had learned, over the course of a life that had handed her things and then taken them back, not to grip too hard at the good moments before they had time to become solid. She let it be what it was, and she did her work, and she made the biscuits every morning, and the kitchen kept being the heart of the ranch, and the days moved forward. On Monday, the letter from the Bozeman Hotel arrived about the supply contract. She read it at the kitchen table, carefully, twice. And then she brought it to Nathaniel in the office, because she had said she would handle the contract herself, and she intended to. But she also trusted his judgment on the business terms more than her own, and she was not too proud to say so. He read it. He pointed out 2 clauses she should push back on: delivery schedule and pricing adjustment terms, and told her exactly how to word the response. She wrote the letter at the kitchen table that evening, and he sat across from her reading his accounts and did not offer any opinion she didn't ask for. Which was exactly the right amount of involvement. She sent the letter Tuesday. By Friday, she had a revised offer that incorporated both changes. They moved fast, Nathaniel said when she showed him. The article, she said. Thomas Hartley did you a considerable service, he said. He told a true story, she said. I did the rest. He looked at her over the letter with that warm, quiet expression that kept showing up more reliably than it used to. Yes, he said, you did. She signed the contract on Saturday morning. Exactly 1 week after the kitchen table conversation that had changed the terms of everything. She held the signed paper for a moment before she folded it for the envelope. And she thought about Cheyenne, and the hotel in Cheyenne, and Mrs. Hargrove's voice explaining about image and presentation, and the reference letter so vague it was nearly useless. She thought about what it meant to hold a contract with a Bozeman hotel under her own name, earned by her own work, unmediated by anyone's opinion of what she looked like. She folded it, she sealed it. She gave it to Pete to take into town with the Morning Post. Then she went back to the kitchen and made breakfast for 12 men. Because the contract was signed, and the morning was still a morning, and 12 men still needed to eat. The second week brought Eli's crisis, which she had not seen coming, and which arrived on a Tuesday evening in the form of the boy sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee and the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long and had finally put it down to look at it. She was cleaning up after supper. She had been aware of him for about 20 minutes, aware that he'd come in and sat down and hadn't said anything, which was not entirely unusual for Eli, but had a different quality tonight. She finished what she was doing, refilled his cup from the pot without being asked, and sat down. Talk, she said. He looked at his cup. I got a letter from my father, he said. She waited. He wants me to come home, Eli said. He's got a farm in Nebraska. He's been running it alone since my ma died, and he needs help, and he stopped. He says I've been out here long enough playing cowboy, that it's time I came back and did something real. Playing cowboy, she said. That's what he said, Eli said. The hurt in his voice was the clean, uncomplicated kind, the kind that came from a person you loved not seeing you clearly. How long have you been on this ranch, she said. 2 years, he said. Since I was 17. And in those 2 years, she said. Have you been playing at something? Or doing something? He looked up at her. I've been doing something, he said. Then you know the answer, she said. The question is whether you believe it. He was quiet for a moment. I don't want to go back, he said. I don't. Nebraska is not. He stopped. I'm not the person my father needs me to be, he said. I've never been that person. I tried for 16 years. She looked at him carefully. Does your father know who you are, she asked. A long pause. No, Eli said. I don't think so. Does he know who you've become out here? Another pause. I wrote to him about the competition, Eli said. About your win. He wrote back and said it was good I was keeping the cook happy. Something in Adeline's chest tightened. She looked at this boy, this 19-year-old, who had shown up to the barn to see her off on competition morning with his hair uncombed, who had sat at her kitchen table asking questions about technique and timing, who had said you're going to be the best thing in that room, with complete certainty and no performance in it, and she felt the particular kind of anger that came from watching someone be made invisible by a person who should have been paying better attention. Eli, she said, you told me weeks ago that you'd been in rooms your whole life where you weren't supposed to be, she said. According to everyone else in the room. Yeah, he said. You helped me understand something when you said that, she said. You helped me understand that I wasn't the only one who'd been carrying that. And that we both went in anyway. She paused. Going home to Nebraska to be the person your father needs is one choice. Staying here and being who you already are is another. But the one thing you don't get to do is let someone else's failure to see you become your belief about what you're worth. She looked at him steadily. Your father not seeing you clearly is his failure. Not yours. Eli was quiet for a long time. His hands were still around the cup. What would you do, he said. I can't tell you that, she said. But I can tell you what I did. I stopped going to places that required me to be smaller than I was. And I came here. You're already here. That's already done. He sat with that. He drank his coffee. After a while, he said, I'm not going back. All right, she said. I need to write him a letter, he said. You do, she said. It's going to be hard, he said. Yes, she said. The true ones usually are. He nodded. He stood up and took his cup to the counter and rinsed it. He'd started doing that a few weeks ago. Without being asked, which she had noted with quiet satisfaction, and he said, At the door, thank you, Miss Mercer. Adeline, she said. He looked at her. What? You've been here long enough, she said. It's Adeline. The grin that crossed his face was the real one, the full one that changed everything. Yes, ma'am, he said. Adeline. And he went out to the bunkhouse to write the hardest letter of his 19 years. And she sat at the kitchen table for a while and thought about fathers who didn't see their children clearly, and mothers who did, and grandmothers who taught you everything worth knowing before you were old enough to understand what they were giving you. She thought about her own grandmother. She thought about the recipe box with its cracked lid, sitting on the counter as it always did now. She thought about what it meant to carry someone's love in an object across 11 days on a stage and 4 miles of Montana summer and every single closed door in between, and how the carrying of it was itself a kind of inheritance. She got up. She banked the stove. She went to bed. The third week brought Eleanor Aldridge back, and this time, nothing about it was what Adeline expected. She came on a Wednesday afternoon. Again to the kitchen door, again alone. But the posture was different this time. The composed, rehearsed quality was gone. She knocked and waited, and when Adeline opened the door, Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was just a face tired. Uncertain, more human than any version of it Adeline had seen before. I'm not here to cause trouble, Eleanor said. Come in, Adeline said. Eleanor came in. She sat at the kitchen table, sat without being invited, which was the most natural she had ever been in this room. Adeline poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her and waited. My mother-in-law is dying, Eleanor said. Adeline was still. She's been ill for some time. She won't see the spring. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup. She started the competition 22 years ago, before the Aldridge family had any real standing in this county. Before we had any of, she gestured briefly at what the Aldridge name had become. She started it because she believed that the frontier needed ways to celebrate what women built here, what women sustained here, because the men got the credit for the cattle and the land, and she thought someone ought to notice what was happening in the kitchens. Adeline looked at her. She read Hartley's article, Eleanor said, 3 times. Apparently, she had my husband read it to her because her eyes aren't good anymore. She paused. She asked me to come and tell you that she thinks the competition did exactly what she always intended it to do. This year, with you, Eleanor's voice was steady, but working at it. She said she wants you to know that. Adeline sat with that for a long moment. What's her name? She said. Margaret, Eleanor said. Margaret Aldridge. Tell her I'm grateful, Adeline said. Tell her the competition changed things for me. That's true, and I want her to know it. Eleanor nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. I owe you an apology, she said. A real one, not the complicated, hedged kind I gave you at the competition. A plain one. She looked up. I treated you as a problem before I treated you as a person. That was wrong. Yes, Adeline said, it was. Eleanor looked at her startled. Maybe, by the plainness of it. Then something in her face settled. Thank you for not making it easier than it was, she said. I've gotten out of the habit of making things easier than they are, Adeline said. It doesn't serve anyone. Eleanor nodded. She drank her coffee. And then carefully, like someone testing new ground, she said, Would you be willing to talk to me sometime about the beef preparation? The braised method. My cook has never gotten it right, and I've been trying to explain it for years. Adeline looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come on a Thursday. I'll show you." Eleanor looked at her. "You'd do that." Margaret Aldridge started a competition so that what women built in kitchens would be recognized, Adeline said. I think she'd appreciate two women sitting in one and talking about bone broth. Eleanor held her gaze. And then, for the first time in any room they had ever shared, Eleanor Aldridge smiled, a real one, unguarded, the kind that made her look 10 years younger, and considerably less like a woman who had been managing impressions her entire adult life. "Thursday," she said. "I'll be here." She finished her coffee. She thanked Adeline. She left. Adeline sat at the table for a while after she was gone. She thought about Margaret Aldridge, dying having the article read to her 3 times. She thought about a woman who had started something 22 years ago because she believed kitchens deserved recognition. She thought about the strange, circular way that things connected, how the competition built by one Margaret had been judged fairly because of Eleanor's last-minute intervention, and how that outcome had led her to this table, and how this table had become something she hadn't had since her grandmother's kitchen, which was a place where the full truth of things could be said and received. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel came in. He saw her face and said, without preamble, "What happened?" She told him. All of it. He listened the way he always listened, completely. Without interruption, without leaping to response before she'd finished. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, coming on a Thursday," he said. "Is that a problem?" she said. "No," he said. "It's surprising. A lot of things have been surprising lately," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Good surprising or bad surprising?" She looked at him. "You tell me," she said. The quiet that followed was the warm kind. He reached across and touched her hand briefly, the way he did things that mattered, and said, "Good. Definitively good." She turned her hand over and held his for a moment. "Yes," she said definitively. November arrived, and with it the first hard frost, and the ranch shifted into its winter preparation with the efficient urgency of a place that had been through this before and knew exactly what needed doing. The men worked longer on some days and shorter on others, depending on what the season required. And Adeline adjusted the kitchen accordingly. More hot food, more substantial meals, the kinds of things that stayed with a man through cold hours of outdoor work. She had been at Brooks Ranch for 4 months. She thought about that sometimes. In the mornings before the stove was fully hot and the day hadn't started yet. 4 months. She had arrived with a cracked recipe box and a week's worth of wages from the hotel in Cheyenne, and the conviction, not a brave conviction, but a desperate one, that she was not going to beg for her place in the world anymore. She had knocked on a door and been given a week's trial, and she had made a stew that tasted like someone cared. And everything that followed had followed from that. She had a supply contract with a Bozeman hotel. She had a letter from the Territorial Agricultural Society inviting her to serve on the judging panel for next year's competition. She had Ruth Calloway writing to her from the other side of the county. Long letters full of practical information about cooking in frontier conditions and the occasional sharp observation about the men in Ruth's life, which Adeline read with great enjoyment and answered with equal frankness. She had Eleanor Aldridge coming on Thursdays. That had turned into something she genuinely looked forward to, which continued to surprise her. Eleanor was sharp and direct, and had strong opinions about most things, and the experience of having gotten many of them wrong had not diminished the strength of the opinions, but had added a layer of self-awareness that made the conversation interesting. She was learning the beef preparation with the focused determination of someone who had decided to be good at something and was not interested in being bad at it for long. She had Eli, who had sent the letter to Nebraska and received back a response that was not what he had hoped for and was not entirely what he had feared his father had not understood. But he had also not demanded. The wound was there and would take time. But Eli was still at the ranch, and he was still coming into the kitchen in the mornings, and he had started, quietly and without making anything of it, to ask her to teach him things. Not professionally, he wasn't going to be a cook. But he wanted to know how things worked, why the bread rose when it did. What made the difference between a meal that was just food and a meal that was something else? She taught him because she believed, as her grandmother had believed, that knowing how to feed people was one of the most fundamentally useful things a person could know, and that it had nothing to do with whether cooking was your livelihood. She had Pete, who said little and noticed everything, and whose 12 years of loyalty to this ranch were. She understood now, not just professional personal, in the way that matters, the way that means a person has decided, this place is worth their best effort, not because of what they're paid, but because of what it is. She had Cody, who had told her last week, with the compressed dignity of a man who found emotional expression genuinely uncomfortable, that she was the best thing that had happened to this outfit since Nathaniel had bought the North Pasture in 1879. She had understood that for Cody, this was approximately equivalent to a formal declaration of admiration, and had thanked him with equal seriousness. And she had Nathaniel. She had Nathaniel, who came into the kitchen every evening, and who had stopped pretending he came for the coffee, and who talked to her now, actually talked, in the unhurried way of a man who had stopped rationing himself, about the ranch, and about the past, and about the things he thought about when he was out in the far fields and there was nobody to talk to. He talked about Margaret, his wife, in the careful way of someone who had loved and lost, and needed to be able to say the name without the grief consuming the conversation. She listened the way she listened to everything completely, and she did not try to fill the silences that needed to stay silences, and she did not pretend the grief was smaller than it was. And he looked at her after those conversations with a gratitude that was quiet and specific, and not at all the same as pity, which was the only thing she had never wanted from anyone. She talked to him, too, about Cheyenne and the hotel and the 3 years of good work and the Tuesday morning that undid it. About the towns after Cheyenne and the specific taxonomy of rejection, the polite kind, the blatant kind, the kind that was dressed up as concern for her well-being, but was really just convenience for someone else. About her grandmother and the recipe box, and what it meant to carry that box into every room she wasn't supposed to be in and put it on the counter like she belonged there. He listened the way she listened, without interrupting, without rushing to reassure, and then he would say something that was exactly the right thing, not because he was trying to say the right thing, but because he understood what had actually been said, which was different and considerably rarer. She thought, sometimes, that she had spent her entire life looking for a room where she was simply allowed to be the size she actually was, not smaller, not adjusted, not made palatable, and that she had found it. Improbably, in a ranch kitchen in Montana, in a house owned by a man who had said their loss without thinking about it, and had meant it with everything he had. The proposal came on a night in late November, and it was not what she expected, which in retrospect was exactly right. She had not been expecting it that evening specifically. She had been expecting it in the general sense that she had been in possession of Nathaniel's declaration for 6 weeks, and she understood the trajectory they were on. But she had not placed a specific date on it in her mind, because Nathaniel moved at his own pace, and she had learned to trust that pace even when it required patience. She had made soup, a long, slow soup from the last of the fall vegetables and a good bone broth and dried herbs. She'd been saving the kind of soup that was not a special occasion food, but that had become, over the months, one of the things the ranch associated with evenings when everything was all right. The men had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse. Pete had done his horse check. The kitchen was clean. Nathaniel came in at 8 o'clock. He sat at the table. He did not get coffee first, which was unusual enough that she looked at him. He was holding something. She hadn't noticed it, at first a small thing, in his hand, that he set on the table between them when she sat down. It was a ring, simple, a thin gold band with a small stone, not extravagant. not trying to be extravagant. The kind of thing chosen by a man who understood that what mattered was the meaning, and not the performance of the meaning. She looked at it. She looked at him. He did not get down on one knee. He was not that kind of man, and she would not have wanted him to be. He sat at the table across from her, where they had sat for months, and he said, "I know what I want. I've known it for a while. I want you to stay here not as the cook but as my wife. I want to run this ranch with you the way I haven't been able to run it alone, not because the operation needs it, but because I need it. Because I need someone to sit across this table from me for the rest of my life who is exactly who you are." He paused. "I'm not offering you a perfect life. I'm offering you a real one. This ranch, these men, this kitchen, this hard Montana winter that is only going to get harder before it gets easier. And me. A man who is going to take until Christmas to say the things in October he should have said in August." He held her gaze. "But a man who means every single thing he says. Everyone." Adeline looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach. She thought about every door. She thought about the profound and exhausting labor of spending your whole life being told you were too much, and not enough simultaneously too large. Too plain, too ordinary, too impossible to love. She thought about how many times she had absorbed that verdict and carried it forward like it was a true thing. Like the people delivering it had some authority over her worth. She thought about Nathaniel's voice on the first day. Their loss, flat certain, without decoration. She thought about the cracked recipe box on the counter behind her. The same counter where she had made 300 mornings of biscuits. The same counter that had become the center of the most alive she had felt in years. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, a long, slow breath, the kind that had been held for a while. And then he reached across the table and picked up her hand and put the ring on her finger with the careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything that mattered. He held her hand for a moment. "Good," he said. His voice was rough in the way voices went when something real had just happened, and the emotion of it was present in the room whether you were the kind of man who displayed it or not. "Good," she said back. And then she laughed a real laugh. Deep and full, and from somewhere in her that had been quiet for a very long time, and he watched her laugh with an expression on his face that she was going to spend a great deal of the rest of her life being glad existed. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. "The soup's still hot," she said. After a while. "I know," he said. "I could smell it from the porch." "Then let's eat," she said. He got up and got 2 bowls, and she ladled the soup, and they sat at the kitchen table together and ate. And it was not a grand gesture, and it was not a performance, and it was exactly right. Word got around the ranch by morning. She had not told anyone, neither had Nathaniel, but Pete came in for coffee and looked at her left hand and said, "Well, good," in his particular tone of a man who is not surprised and is deeply pleased. Cody came in and looked at her hand, and then at Nathaniel, who had come in from the early morning walk of the property, and said, "About time." Roy came in and said, "Does this mean you're staying?" And when she said yes, he said, "Then I want to be on record that I called Aunt in September, which nobody could verify but everybody was willing to allow." Eli came in and said nothing at all, just looked at her ring. And then at her face, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her in a brief, fierce hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time, and stepped back and said, "I'm real glad," in a voice that cracked only slightly, and went to get his coffee. Pete said, later quietly, "When the others had gone, she would have liked you." She looked at him. "Margaret? Nathaniel's Margaret," he said. "Yes. She would have liked you a great deal." He picked up his cup. She was a woman who didn't have any patience for pretense. She judged people the same way you do, by the work and not the presentation. Adeline was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "That means a great deal." He nodded. He went back to work. He did not make anything more of it. Which was perfectly Pete. The wedding was small. She had not wanted large. Nathaniel had not wanted large. They were married in the ranch yard on a Saturday in December by the county judge, a plain man with a kind face who had read Hartley's article and shaken Adeline's hand when he arrived as if he'd been wanting to for some time. The men were there, all of them, cleaned up and standing straight in the way that men who work with their hands stand straight when they want to show respect. Ruth Calloway had ridden 2 hours from the south end of the county and stood beside Adeline and handed her the small bunch of dried winter flowers she'd brought wrapped in cloth. Eleanor Aldridge came. She stood at the back. She was quiet the whole time. When it was done, and people were moving toward the tables, Adeline had set up for the food. She had cooked everything herself, which was the only way she had wanted it. Eleanor appeared at her side and said, "Very quietly, my mother-in-law passed on Monday." Adeline stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. She knew, Eleanor said, before she went. "I told her what you said, that the competition changed things for you." That it was true. She paused. "She told me to tell you that the best thing you could do in return was let someone else win it next year." Adeline looked at her. "She said that?" "She also said," Eleanor continued, with something in her voice that was not quite composed, "that she was glad the best food won, and that she thought Adeline Mercer was exactly the kind of woman the frontier needed more of." Adeline stood still in the middle of her wedding day and felt the full weight of that, a woman she had never met, whose family had tried to push her out of a competition, dying with her name in her mouth as something worth saying. "I'll win it one more time," Adeline said, "next year. And then I'll step back and let someone else have it. Someone who needs it the way I needed it." Eleanor nodded. Her composure was holding, but it was working at it. "That's what she would have wanted," she said. They stood together for a moment in the December cold. Two women who had started as opponents and become something else, not friends exactly. Not yet, but something real and in progress. Then Eli appeared with 2 plates of food and said, "You both need to eat," in a tone that brooked no argument. And they ate. She stood at the kitchen counter on the last morning of December. 1 year almost exactly from the day she had first heard about Brooks Ranch from an old man on a bench in town. And she thought about everything that counter had held. The cracked recipe box was still there. She had not fixed the lid. She had decided, somewhere in the fall, that she was not going to fix it. The crack was part of the box now, part of what it had been through. Part of the story of how it had gotten here. Her grandmother had told her once that the things that showed their damage were more honest than the things that tried to hide it. And she had been too young to fully understand that then, and understood it now entirely. Nathaniel came in. He stood behind her close, the comfortable closeness of people who have decided on each other, and said, "What are you thinking about?" "The box," she said. He looked at it. "What about it?" "I'm thinking about the morning I slammed it on a counter in town," she said. "Before I knew you. Before I knew any of this was here." She paused. "I was so angry, and so tired of being angry, and I picked it back up and I walked out and I didn't have any idea where I was going. And then," he said. "And then an old man on a bench told me about a ranch," she said. "And I walked 4 miles and I knocked on a door." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm glad you knocked." She turned and looked at him. She looked at this man who had opened the door, who had said their loss without thinking about it, who had sat across kitchen tables from her for months and listened and learned the difference between her quiettes, and who had offered her a real life and meant every word of it. "So am I," she said. He kissed her the way he did everything. Without performance, without ceremony, just directly, and with his whole attention, and she put her hand flat against his chest and felt a steady beat of him and thought, "This is what I walked 4 miles toward. This is what was at the end of all those closed doors." She stepped back. She turned to the stove. She had 12 men to feed and a morning to make and a ranch to run and a life to live that was entirely and completely hers. The biscuits went in at 6:15. They came out at 6:40, golden and exact and layered the way they always were now. Because her hands knew this recipe the way they knew nothing else in the world. The way you know the things you have made and remade until they are as much yours as your own name. The men came in at 7. The kitchen filled with boots and coffee and the low morning sounds of people who were where they belonged. Eli came in last, hair uncombed as always, and looked at the biscuits and said, "Perfect," every time Adeline said, and she meant that. About the biscuits, about the morning, about all of it. She had come to Willow Creek, Montana, carrying a cracked recipe box and a decision she had made at the bottom of her last reserves that she was not going to make herself smaller anymore. Not for any town, not for any room, not for any person who needed her to be less than she was in order to feel comfortable with what they thought they knew about her worth. She had walked into every closed door and past every pair of eyes that looked at her the way those eyes had looked. And she had kept walking, and she had put her box on the counter at Station 7 and cooked what she knew how to cook. And she had stood in a kitchen and told a man what she needed from him before she even knew his name. She had been large and imperfect and hungry for a life that was real. And she had refused finally, completely, without apology, to let any of that be the reason she couldn't have one. The right person, she had learned, did not require you to be smaller. The right person made room, and she had made room too for an old man's kindness on a bench. For a boy who needed someone to see him, for a woman who arrived as an opponent and stayed as something else, for a quiet rancher who meant every word he said and had been saying them steadily since the moment she walked through his door. She had built something here, not a recipe, not a reputation. Something far harder and far more lasting than either. She had built a place where a person was judged by the work of their hands and the content of their heart. And nothing else and nothing less. That was what she had made. And it was, without question, the best thing she had ever cooked.